Language of the Heart. Begin for the Part 2. Wico Audio Libros. Biblioteca Virtual. A tomorrow, July 1960. From the Grapevine Book A Today, published on the occasion of A's 25th anniversary. This book has given us some wonderful glimpses of the panorama of AA at work in the 25th year of its founding. We marvel and rejoice that the near impossible has really happened. All this has indeed depended on our many channels of communication and our singular ability to use them. Now comes the question, where do we go from here and what is our responsibility for today and for tomorrow? Clearly our first duty to AA's future is to maintain in full strength what we now have. Only the most vigilant caretaking can assure this. Never should we be lulled into complacent self-satisfaction by the wide acclaim and success that is everywhere ours. This is the subtle temptation which could stagnate us today, perchance disintegrate us tomorrow. We have always rallied to meet and transcend failure and crisis. Problems have been our stimulants. How well, though, shall we be able to meet the problems of success? Will we continue to search out the ever-present flaws and gaps in our communications? With enough imagination, courage, and dedication, will we resolutely address ourselves to those many tasks of repair and improvement which even now the future is calling upon us to undertake? Still clearer vision and an ever-mounting sense of responsibility can be the only answers to these questions. What, then, is the real size and reach of our foreseeable responsibilities? During the last 25 years it is quite certain that 25 million men and women throughout the world have suffered alcoholism. Nearly all of these are now sick, mad, or dead. AA has brought recovery to something like 250,000. The rest are still out of reach or else gone beyond recall. An even larger generation of drunks is right now in the making. Facing the enormity of the situation, shall any of us sit comfortably and say, "Well, people, here we are. We hope you hear about us and come around. Then maybe we can give you a hand"? Of course we shall do nothing of the sort. We know that we are going to open, wider and wider, every conceivable means and channel through which these kinsfolk of ours may be reached. We shall remember Dr. Bob and his marvelous co-worker, Sister Ignatia, how they worked in Akron. We shall remember the many years of Silky's unstinted labor for us. 10,000 AAS still around will remember how they literally owe their lives to these three people. Each of us will remember his own sponsor, the one who cared enough. As the inheritors of such a tradition of service, how many could ever say, "Let George do that 12th step job, he likes to work with drunks anyhow. Besides, I'm busy"? Surely there could not be many. Complacency would be impossible. Our next great area of future responsibility may be this one. I'm thinking about the total problem of alcohol and about all of those who still must suffer the appalling consequences of alcoholism. Their number is astronomical, it runs into hundreds of millions. Here's just a sampling of that problem. Because of our drinking, most of us banged up our kids. Their emotional scars should have made them naturals for alcoholism. Yet it is startlingly true that teenage children of good AA members show almost no sign of becoming drunks. They drink moderately or not at all. If a few of the vulnerable do hit the bottle, and the telltale symptoms and episodes show up, most can stop and they do. Now why is this? The answer is alcohol education AA style. Of course we have never told our kids not to drink. But for years, around the house and at meetings, they have heard what the score really is, what alcoholism can do to people. They have seen the old man in action, first as an alcoholic, then as an AA member. This is the kind of education that has no doubt already saved 100,000 of our children. But what about other people's kids? Have we no concern for them? Of course we do have concern. While we appreciate that AA itself cannot very well get into alcohol education or into any of the related activities that touch the total problem, we do know that, as peculiarly well-informed citizens, there is plenty we can, and should, do in these fields. Enterprises of this sort, governmental, state, and private, have been springing up everywhere in recognition of the fact that alcoholism is a top priority problem of health. Nearly every one of these agencies tells us it has been inspired to work on by the example we AAS have set them. They now take their turn as pioneers. Naturally, they are bound to make some mistakes. Certainly, we can understand this. In fact, we like to say that we ourselves have progressed mostly by trial and error. A good number of these undertakings are now going places and their promise is very large. Nevertheless, I gather the impression that many of us are so intent on their few errors, especially the errors of those AAS associated with them, that we often fail to give these dedicated people the encouragement they much need. Now that we AAS have so amazingly unified around our single purpose and the 12 traditions, the risk that we could be much hurt by anything done in these outside ventures is virtually non-existent. Let's instead keep focused on the fact that there are some 24,750,000 drunks left in the world. Could not still more friendly and widespread cooperation with outside agencies finally lead us to countless alcoholics who will otherwise be lost? Maybe we are beginning to stand in our own light. Perhaps we are blocking a communication that has a tremendous potential. Shouldn't we therefore have a fresh look at this? Inside AA, well, how do we stand? It is a fact, and a perfectly explicable one, that the number of Al-Anon family groups has jumped from a handful to 1,300 of them in the last 10 years. They are tackling one of the toughest problems that an alcoholic and his family can have, inside AA or out. This is the terrific distortion that we alcoholics force upon our wives and husbands, through destructive drinking that has led us into a highly abnormal dependency upon them. Active drunks frequently turn themselves into rebellious and wayward children, thereby compelling their marriage partners to become their protective custodians, their mamas and papas. This has often resulted in a built-in pattern, one most difficult to erase. The coming of sobriety in AA is seldom a remedy. Indeed, sobriety sometimes aggravates this often intolerable condition. The Al-Anon family groups, comprised of wives and husbands of alcoholics, now see this picture clearly, far more clearly, in fact, than do most of us AAS. In their own groups they are now working to repair that damage along with their other defects by the practice of AA's 12 steps. More than some of us, these life partners of ours are trying hard to practice AA principles in all their affairs. The family groups have already made a big dent in this mighty tough problem, and there is evidence of far more to come. Can't we therefore give this remarkable project our greatest possible understanding and encouragement? And let each of us do his full share of that repair job at home. Then there is among us AAS the ever-present need for further spiritual growth. Here most of us show a heavy deficit, and I'm a notable example. The simplest self-questioning can reveal such deficiencies. For instance, am I trying to practice these principles in all my own affairs? Or am I simply complacent and quite content with just enough spiritual nourishment to keep me sober? Do I really possess the spiritual resources to see me through some rough going? Or do I think pretty well of my spiritual demonstration because, A, things are pretty good at home, B, I got a big raise, and C, they made me vice president of my lodge? Or if things go badly and I begin to be jittery, depressed, anxious, or resentful, do I then justify my resulting self-pity and guilt by blaming my bad breaks or, more usually, the behavior of other people? Or do I fall back on the old refrain that I'm a sick alcoholic and therefore not responsible? Nearly all of us, when we think about it, agree that we are a long way from being anywhere near grown up, from almost any point of view. We can clearly see that our job as individuals and as a fellowship is to keep right on growing by the constant use of our 12 steps. Of course, we may be certain that this will be a slow business. But we also know we can never take our plodding progress as the slightest alibi for setting ourselves second-rate goals. Our high aim can be emotional sobriety, full emotional maturity, and that's good. However, I think most of us may prefer a still larger definition, one with a still broader and higher reach. Perhaps there can be no relative in the universe unless somewhere there is an absolute. To most of us this absolute is God as we understand him. We feel that we were born to this life to grow if only a little toward that likeness and image. However small and prudent our next immediate step on the path of progress may be, we of AA can never set any hampering limitation upon the ultimate destiny of ourselves and our fellowship, nor any whatever upon God's love for us all. Individually and collectively, structurally and spiritually, we shall ever need to build for the future. We are still laying down the foundation on which all coming generations of AAS will have to stand, perhaps for centuries. Our fellowship has been permitted to achieve, though still in miniature, the one world dream of philosophers. Ours is a world in which we can hotly differ, yet never think of schism or conflict as a solution. As a fellowship we ask nothing of wealth or power. As we better use the language of the heart, our communications grow apace. Already we find ourselves in safe passage through all those barriers of distance and language, of social distinctions, nationality, and creed, that so divide the world of our time. For so long as we remain sure that our one world of AA is God's gift rather than any virtue earned or created by ourselves, and for so long as our one world continues to be ever more inclusive of those in need, and for so long as we speak and try to perfect the language of love for just so long, may we count upon making whatever rendezvous with destiny that God would have us. Our Pioneers Overseas, October 1960. I've just finished reading the printer's galleys for this international number of our Grapevine. There are deeply stirring communications from South Africa, Northern Rhodesia, and the Congo, from Japan, Indonesia, New Guinea, Tasmania, Australia, from Cuba, Trinidad, and Jamaica, from Saudi Arabia, and from West Germany, Denmark, Holland, Finland, Ireland, Scotland, and England. Yet this eye-arresting array of AA's overseas beachheads and bases reveals scarcely more than a quarter of our total activity in distant places and countries. Out on those far reaches there are hundreds of groups and thousands of fellow members. Our language of the heart is already spoken in perhaps a dozen tongues. This is the pioneering front of AA today. We often speak of our loners, of our solitary groups, and of our several large centers abroad, as beachheads, bases, and fronts. But in a very real sense these descriptions are misnomers. Though our AA loners and groups do live and do carry our message in many areas of danger and revolution, there is no evidence that they fear their surroundings, there is little sign that their presence in these hotspots is unwanted. Their entire non-aggressiveness, their single purpose of bringing a new light to all who suffer alcoholism, is perfectly clear. Theirs are beachheads for health and for faith, and this is for all to see. Witness the AA who, on an errand of peace, recently drove alone across the whole African continent and emerged unscathed. Then think of those loners stationed in other areas of strife, how they continue to maintain their sobriety and struggle to start new groups. Please remember the intense concern of the AA who felt he had failed a fellow member who had committed suicide. Ponder the good humor of the Middle East AA meeting as its members gather in a secret rendezvous lest the military authorities or some of our Mohammedan friends, who never drink, might be offended. Consider, in these articles, the problems of those fast-growing overseas centers just now emerging from their pioneering time, how they have slowly gained the confidence of medicine, religion, and the press, how they have finally grown into unity through an ever better application of our 12 traditions, how they have tried to make good their desperate lack of language translations, and how they have well begun to cross all barriers of race, creed, or social condition. This, and more, can be read in and between these special lines which they have penned for this GV international issue. Beyond doubt, this exciting pioneering front of AA today brings great promise of a vast worldwide unfoldment for tomorrow. Our friends abroad well understand that this is no time for complacent relaxation. Their letters eloquently portray their intense industry and dedication. So then, What can we do here in North America? Well, we can greatly increase the tempo of what we have been doing. Let's scan just a small sampling of our overseas projects. Americans and Canadians alike are much traveled in these days. Therefore let each traveler remember that many a group abroad has been started by a voyaging AA like himself or herself. We have a world directory. Let all such messengers be supplied with this valuable means of communication. This can mean untold inspiration to the loner or the group to be found at many a destination. Here, for instance, is a crying current need. As this grapevine goes to press, pandemonium has broken loose in Paris. One paper there is carrying a series of sensational pieces about AA in America. To say the least, that characteristic desire of the French to be dramatic has been going pretty far. One of these articles describes my first meeting in 1934 with my own sponsor, Evie. It displays a screaming headline about 2 inches high. Allegedly, I say over the phone, "Come quickly, Evie, I have gin." Despite this astounding and most comical distortion of our 12th step approach, the French alkies are nevertheless flocking to the AA colors. Our tiny group at Paris is nearly swamped. Scarcely a one of them can speak French. So, AA travelers, there in Paris is your chance, especially if you can parlez-vous. Then we have the men on ships, those internationalists of ours. May their numbers and their dedication continue to grow. They have already planted and nurtured AA all over the world. To them we all exclaim, may your plantings increase and may your harvests bulge the AA granaries. Now look into our efforts at GSOA's world headquarters. We can surely enlarge those overseas services. To eliminate the distressing garble that has plagued many distant AA groups for years, we shall need to furnish far more and better translations of our basic literature. Sheer lack of an understanding of AA's 12 traditions has routinely created chaotic conditions in many a land. Even our book Alcoholics Anonymous has seen but 2 complete translations. In mimeograph form the bare text of the book can be read in only 2 more tongues. Of course this challenge has to be met, and very soon, we believe. Our whole foreign department at New York headquarters must be enlarged. There is an urgent need for more staff work, which would mean far better communication with those abroad. Until recently, no overseas group had ever been visited by anyone from our world headquarters excepting Lois and me. That visit was 10 years ago. Of course we deeply hope that we can still make a few similar journeys. But even these, if made, could scarcely add up to the consistent personal contact that will one of these days be needed. So, AAS in America, let us back our overseas pioneers to the limit. Without delay, let's back them with a still more lively understanding, with still more dedicated travelers, and with every bit of aid and information and inspiration that we can send to them across the waters. In this respect no single agency can do more than our world headquarters. Here all of us can participate. Here a few more contribution dollars can make an enormous difference, something that we shall be bound to remember every time the hat is specially passed for this great and unique service purpose. I am sure that we shall soon press these and many more projects into a far higher gear. Then our pioneers beyond the seas will feel that they have something more than our interested approval and occasional help. They will know that our constant and unstinted love has become theirs and theirs for keeps. Freedom under God, the choice is ours. November 1960. In its deeper sense, AA is a quest for freedom, freedom under God. Of course the immediate object of our quest is sobriety, freedom from alcohol and from all its baleful consequences. Without this freedom, we have nothing at all. Paradoxically, though, we can achieve no liberation from the alcohol obsession until we become willing to deal with those character defects which have landed us in that helpless condition. Even to gain sobriety only, we must attain some freedom from fear, anger, and pride, from rebellion and self-righteousness, from laziness and irresponsibility, from foolish rationalization and outright dishonesty, from wrong dependencies and destructive power driving. In this freedom quest, we are always given 3 choices. A rebellious refusal to work upon our glaring defects can be a ticket to destruction. Or, for a time, we can stay sober with a minimum of self-improvement and settle ourselves into a comfortable but often dangerous mediocrity. Or we can continuously try hard for those sterling qualities which can add up to greatness of spirit and action, true and lasting freedom under God, the freedom to find and do His will. For most of us this last choice is really ours. We must never be blinded by the futile philosophy that we are just the hapless victims of our inheritance, our life experience, and our surroundings, that these are the sole forces that make our decisions for us. This is not the road to freedom. We have to believe that we can really choose. Similarly, our whole society, and every group in it, will constantly face these identical decisions. Shall we settle for destruction? Shall we try only for the temporary comforts of a complacent mediocrity? Or shall we consistently face the disciplines, make the sacrifices, and endure the discomforts that will qualify us to walk the path that invariably leads toward true greatness of spirit and action? These reflections are meant to be background for the theme of this article, the 12 Traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. AA's traditions are the yardstick by which our fellowship can accurately measure its progress or the lack of it. In our traditions we see such wisdom as we have been able to muster in a quarter of a century of living and working together. That these principles stake out the path we ought to follow there can be little doubt. As we contemplate the traditions we see that they have two main characteristics, and that each of these aspects reinforces the other. The first aspect of the 12 traditions is protection, the second aspect is progress. We are first reminded what our fellowship's temptations really are and by what means we may best deal with them. This is our basis for a continuous moral inventory of our collective behavior, the first step to actively casting aside our roadblocks. In the affirmative or positive aspect of the traditions we learn, both directly and impliedly, how we may best apply the high ideals of sacrifice and willing responsibility, trust and love, in our relations with each other and with the world around us. Out of these practices flows the spiritual energy that moves us along the road to full liberation. As we ponder protection, we see that our traditions warn against the perils of public fame and power, against the perils of great wealth, against the making of compromising alliances, against professionalism. We are reminded that we may deny no alcoholic his membership, that we must never create an authoritative government of men. We are cautioned that we should never force AA's message upon the world by aggressive promotional schemes, and that we should shun public controversy as the devil himself. Such are typical examples of the protective prudence which our 12 traditions directly express, or clearly imply. Some claim that these warnings are nothing but the sum of our collective fears. Once upon a time this was very true. In our first years, every violation of these precepts seemed to threaten our actual existence. We then doubted if our rebellious membership could ever resist its great temptations. But we have resisted, and so we have survived. Therefore the stark fears of yesterday have since given way to a vigilant prudence, something quite different from unreasoning panic. Of course, we know that we shall always have to deal with the fearful forces which are released when the human ego runs amok, the same forces that are shattering the world of our time. Deliver us from temptation must therefore continue to be a prime ingredient of our every attitude, practice, and prayer. When things go well, we must never fall into the error of believing that no great ill can possibly befall us. Nor should we accuse ourselves of negative thinking when we insist on facing the destructive forces in and around us, both realistically and effectively. Vigilance will always be the price of survival. This is the protective aspect of our traditions. But AA's 12 traditions should provide us with far more than protection against mediocrity and dissolution, and they do. Let's now think about the positive, the progressive side of AA's traditions, the disciplined sacrifices and responsibilities that we shall need to undertake, the degree of mutual trust and love that we shall need to achieve if we are to find the greater freedom we seek. The length of this article will not admit a full examination of all 12 traditions in this respect, but a few examples can serve to illustrate just what we mean. Take Tradition 1. It says that A's common welfare comes first. This really means that our personal ambitions will have to be set aside every time they conflict with the safety or the effectiveness of our fellowship. It means that we must sometimes love our society more than ourselves. Tradition 2 states, "For our group purpose there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern." This is a study in mutual trust in God, in ourselves, and in our service leadership. This has been one of our finest experiments and it has succeeded far beyond our expectations. Tradition 3 defines the personal liberty of the AA member. It says, in effect, that any alcoholic can be an AA member the moment he says so. Neither can any of us deprive him of that membership, no matter what his behavior. Perhaps no other society has ever staked out such a broad expanse of liberty for the individual as this. Every AA newcomer feels at once that he is wanted and trusted and loved. How well we understand his needs. Certainly we have had them ourselves. Seldom has any alcoholic taken unfair advantage of that unlimited charter for freedom. We took this decision for individual freedom years ago. We are glad that we did, there has never been any cause for regret. Tradition 4 is yet another confident declaration of mutual trust and love as it flows from each AA group to the other. We give each group full autonomy, the undisturbed right to manage its own affairs. To make this condition doubly permanent and secure, we have guaranteed to all AA groups that they will never be subjected to any centralized government or authority. In turn, each group agrees that it will never take any action that could injure us all. Rarely indeed has any AA group ever forgotten that precious trust. Tradition 7 proclaims AA's principle of self-support. In it, we undertake to pay every cent of our own service expenses, meanwhile declining outside contributions. The fact that we don't take money from the outside world builds confidence in every alcoholic who thinks of approaching us. This we know. Public goodwill has also been increased because people like the idea that the once irresponsible alcoholics have now become responsible. There is no doubt, either, that this salutary practice takes us in the direction of increased freedom for ourselves. By resolutely declining outside funds, whether offered by individual donors or by governments, we are making dead sure that we shall always preserve our own liberty of action. Hence the old adage, "Who pays the piper calls the tune," will never be descriptive of us. There is little question that large sums could be raised today for AA, that is, if we ever gave the word. Perhaps no greater calamity could befall our fellowship than such a development. We would be at once absolved from the beneficial responsibility of raising our own funds. With lots of other people's money available, our idea A-minute members would doubtless conceive countless schemes for doing good. In those few past instances where we have taken outside money, distraction and contention within has been the almost uniform result. Therefore we are well aware that the responsibility for full self-support brings us great spiritual and practical blessings. This is sacrificial prudence at its best, chief bulwark to our cherished freedoms. Another example, Tradition 10 is an emphatic warning against public controversy. This was perhaps the first AA tradition ever to take shape. Of course we did reserve that sometimes enjoyable right of quarreling among ourselves about lesser matters. But when it came to the awful issues that rock society about us, such as politics, religion, reform, and the like, well, the early AAs knew these terrible conflicts were surely not for them. Later on, a new aspect of this same peril came into view. All sorts of people and organizations begged us to take stands, deliver opinions, and fight evils, all up and down the line. Again we instantly saw that if we ever embarked upon such a course, it would certainly be our finish. Drunks by the thousands would be kept away from AA through sheer prejudice. The same old peril would again menace us. This time it would crash in from the outside. This was when we AAS knew for sure that we had to be at peace internally, and with the world around us. No doubt mankind has wrung many a freedom out of violent controversy and bitter war. Yet we AAS have had to learn that the kinds of freedom that we must possess cannot possibly be obtained by violence. As a fellowship, we cannot fight anybody, anywhere or at any time. This has been proved. When we had directly attacked John Barleycorn, we had lost. Booze fighting had never worked. When we quarrel too much with each other, we get drunk. Hence genuine peace will always be a chief ingredient of AA's freedom. But let none suppose that we shrink from major conflict only because we are afraid. Nowadays we believe we keep the peace because we love each other. Let's now examine that vital tradition 11. It deals with our public relations. Here is our greatest channel of communication to the alcoholic who still suffers. Tradition 11 reads, our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. Since this great tradition describes the most important application of AA's principle of anonymity, and because it sets the pitch and tone of our entire public relations policy, nothing can be more critically important. If personal ambitions ever invade our public relations, we shall be badly crippled. Perhaps lost altogether. The danger, of course, is the possibility that we may one day recklessly abandon the principle of personal anonymity at the top public level. This possibility arises from the fact that many of us AAS have been, and sometimes still are, possessed by enormous power drives. These are frequently fueled by an almost irresistible craving for money, approval, and public acclaim. My own past history is outstanding in this respect. I can well understand the constant temptation to turn oneself into a public figure. Therefore I have urged, in season and out, that we AAS maintain our personal anonymity at the top level, no matter what the personal sacrifices may be. Our chief hope for the future is that these appalling urges of ours will be held in restraint by self-discipline, by love of AA, and by firm group and public opinion. These powerful constructive forces, all working together, have thus far been enough. We pray that they may always prevail. Let's look once more at how immense this temptation really is. A vast communications net now covers the earth, even to its remotest reaches. Granting all its huge public benefits, this limitless world forum is nevertheless a hunting ground for all those who would seek money, acclaim, and power at the expense of society in general. Here the forces of good and evil are locked in struggle. All that is shoddy and destructive contests all that is best. Therefore nothing can matter more to the future welfare of AA than the manner in which we use this colossus of communication. Used unselfishly and well, the results can surpass our present imagination. Should we handle this great instrument badly, we shall be shattered by the ego demands of our own people, often with the best of intention on their part. Against all this, the sacrificial spirit of AA's anonymity at the top public level is literally our shield and our buckler. Here again we must be confident that love of AA, and of God, will always carry the day. Last, in tradition 12, we see anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. This principle, and its enormous implications, touches every aspect of our lives. Anonymity is humility at work. To maintain the humility of our society, we shall constantly take stock of our temptations and of our defects. The spirit of anonymity calls upon each of us for personal sacrifice in every level of our fellowship's undertakings. Only through such willing sacrifices can we AAS meet our responsibilities to ourselves, to the victims of alcoholism everywhere, and to society as a whole. Here we clearly see that only sacrifice can fulfill responsibility, that only high responsibility can lead to mutual trust, and that only mutual trust can be the foundation for great love, each of us for the other, and all of us for God. In just this spirit, all of those present at AA's 25th anniversary in Long Beach rededicated themselves to the service of AA. They knew that the choice was theirs, and they made it. These were their telling words. By God's grace we are here assembled in grateful remembrance of the 25th anniversary of the founding of our fellowship. At this meaningful quarter-century mark we are deeply aware that we stand upon the threshold of a great door which opens wide into our future. Ours can be a destiny of ever-increasing promise and fulfillment. Our faith in this vision has never faltered. But the future would still lack its full use and meaning did it not bring us fresh problems and even acute perils through which we can grow into true greatness of action and spirit. To these ends we have pledged our lives and fortunes. We here rededicate ourselves to an ever-deepening love of each other, love for the wondrous creation in which we live and serve, and love for its supreme author, God Himself. We now entrust you of A's distant reaches, you who so well symbolize the unique and loving communication that is ours in this universal fellowship, to carry this message to fellow members everywhere, and most especially to all those others who still know not, and who, God willing, may soon issue out of their darkness into light. The Shape of Things to Come, February 1961. A's first quarter century is now history. Our next 25 years lie in prospect before us. How, then, can we make the most of this new grant of time? Perhaps our very first realization should be that we can't stand still. Now that our basic principles seem established, now that our functioning is fairly effective and widespread, it would be temptingly easy to settle down as merely one more useful agency on the world scene. We could conclude that AA is fine, just the way it is. Yet how many of us, for example, would presume to declare, well, I'm sober and I'm happy. What more can I want, or do? I'm fine the way I am. We know that the price of such self-satisfaction is an inevitable backslide, punctuated at some point by a very rude awakening. We have to grow or else deteriorate. For us, the status quo can only be for today, never for tomorrow. Change we must, we cannot stand still. Just how, then, can AA go on changing for the better? Does this mean that we are to tinker with our basic principles? Should we try to amend our 12 steps and 12 traditions? Here the answer would seem to be no. Those 24 principles have first liberated us, have then held us in unity, and have enabled us to function and to grow as AA members and as a whole. Of course, perfect truth is surely something better understood by God than by any of us. Nevertheless, we have come to believe that A's recovery steps and traditions do represent the approximate truths which we need for our particular purpose. The more we practice them, the more we like them. So there is little doubt that AA principles continue to be advocated in the form they stand now. So then, if our basics are so firmly fixed as all this, what is there left to change or to improve? The answer will immediately occur to us. While we need not alter our truths, we can surely improve their application to ourselves, to AA as a whole, and to our relation with the world around us. We can constantly step up the practice of these principles in all our affairs. As we now enter upon the next great phase of A's life, let us therefore rededicate ourselves to an ever greater responsibility for our general welfare. Let us continue to take our inventory as a fellowship, searching out our flaws and confessing them freely. Let us devote ourselves to the repair of all faulty relations that may exist, whether within or without. And above all, let us remember that great legion who still suffer from alcoholism and who are still without hope. Let us, at any cost or sacrifice, so improve our communication with all these that they may find what we have found, a new life of freedom under God. The Far Reaches, October 1961. Stirring in its implications and exciting in its drama, this is the Grapevine's international issue. In and between its lines, we are given a wonderful glimpse of A today out on the farthest reaches of our fellowship. Unfailingly, everyone who reads this issue will get a magnificent preview of what AA worldwide will be like tomorrow. One of our South Africa contributors, himself an old-timer down there, ends his article with these strange words, Hambage, Heilige. These are Zulu greetings and mean travel in peace and abide in peace. These poignant expressions, of course, deeply reveal the aspirations and the longings of the whole Zulu community. Surely we of AA can identify with these words quite as well as the Zulus themselves. For is this not exactly what we ourselves have been seeking, first as active alcoholics, and then as AA members? We have always wanted to go out from the place where we were, to a place where there would be peace. The story of AA is the story of our own travels together, in the quest for better things. As our contributor recounts, it is small wonder that his Zulu, Bantu, and Hindu alcoholic friends are now finding their cherished hopes realized as they flock to AA in the Transvaal, and from the regions about. They are traveling with us, and they are finding quiet. The spread of AA abroad is most certainly the story of AAs who have thus traveled, both in the flesh and in the spirit. In these GV pages we find the moving experience of the wife of a diplomat. For descriptive purposes, we call her a loner. Yet she tells us how she was not in the least alone as she flitted first to Norway and then to Indonesia. At this moment she is living even more joyfully in Haiti. Then there is the English lady, also one of our alcoholic sisters, who tells how she fell apart in Singapore, as a necessary prelude to finding herself now well and happy at Malta, where she and another woman form an AA group of 2. And by all means read about our British friend, an army officer and founding father of AA over there, as he describes how, as a so-called loner, he was able to stay perfectly sober in Malaya during a trying season of guerrilla warfare, and then share with him what he found in AA on his return to England. Don't miss, either, that picture of AA in Australia as drawn by an old-timer from down under. I choked up as I read this one, because I could remember when AA had started on that continent with a single letter and a big book sent from New York 20 years ago. Neither should you fail to take in that strange and incredible 12th step job recently done in South Africa. Our GV contributor worked day and night to sponsor a young Hungarian who, along with his mother, had been living in absolute isolation and misery. The language barrier at first seemed impossible to cross. But the sponsor and his client could each read a little from a Latin Bible, and that helped. But the barrier was more than language. The erring prospect turned out to be a deaf-mute. Yet he did sober up, and the story of how that was brought off is amazing. In fact, you ought to read every scrap of this GV International issue. You will surely discover some fresh ideas on how to get from where you are now, to where there is still more quiet. I know that I did. Hambagadal, Halalagadal. Again at the Crossroads, November 1961. We AAS are everywhere developing a keener sense of our history and the meaning of its turning points. Moreover, I believe that we are getting a right sense of our history, something of the utmost importance indeed. The world's past reveals that many societies and nations have fallen victims to fear and pride, or to their aggressive designs. Thus they lost their sense of meaning, purpose, and right destiny, and so they disintegrated and vanished. Neither power nor glory nor wealth could in the least guarantee their long-time survival. There is little on the record of AA's first quarter century to suggest such a fate for us. In our personal lives, and therefore in our fellowship itself, we have steadily striven to lay aside all those vainglorious clamors for prestige, power, and possessions which had ruined so many of us in the drinking days. With those fearful experiences vividly before us, it is not strange that AA's 12 steps continually remind us of the stark need for ego reduction, that our 12 traditions warn heavily against the perils of concentrated wealth, the vain pursuit of fame, and the ever-present temptation to controversy and attack. We did not come to such wisdom by reason of our virtues, our better understanding is rooted in our former follies. In the nick of time, and by God's grace, each of us has been enabled to develop a growing sense of the meaning and purpose of his own life. Because this has been the essence of our individual experience, it is also the essence of our experience as a fellowship. We have suffered enough to learn something of the love of God and of each other. Thus we have been taught to choose those principles and practices by which we can surely survive and grow. This is the spiritual climate in which we AAs are today privileged to live. Even our sometimes erratic behavior since sobriety has never changed this all-pervading climate of humility and love. This, we think, is the spiritual condition which has invited into our midst so much wise and providential guidance. We say this in no conceit, it is an obvious fact of our experience. We only need to ponder the long series of apparently correct choices that we have been enabled to make over the past 26 years, choices respecting our principles and right methods of communicating them. Not a single one of these major decisions has yet shown the slightest sign of being a mistake. Up to now AA seems to have taken the right turning at each new crossroad. This could scarcely have been our doing alone. Our fellowship has afforded a convincing proof of that wise old adage which declares that man's extremity is God's opportunity. This being our record, we can surely face the next hour of decision in confident faith. The fact is that AA does now stand at a new turning point in its affairs. This has to do with the future world service leadership of AA as a whole. Therefore, we shall have to take a new look at the shape of things to come. At this particular crossroad a crucial decision is required of me. And here it is. It is my conviction that I should now retire from all active management of AA World Service affairs, and that my leadership in these matters should be fully transferred to the trustees of AA's General Service Board. This is not at all a new concept, it is simply the last step in a play which has been in development for more than 10 years. It was in mind when, in 1948, Dr. Bob and I jointly wrote an article for the Grapevine which was called, "Why Can't We Join AA?" 2. It was even more in mind when our first General Service Conference was experimentally assembled in 1951. And when, at St. Louis in 1955, the full authority and responsibility for the maintenance of world services was transferred to our conference, my retirement from active service leadership was definitely foreshadowed. Yet a vestige of my old-time status remains, and this should be explained. Following the St. Louis transference there were a few tasks that still required my full attention. But these are now virtually completed. During the last 6 years I have, respecting these particular matters, exercised a joint leadership with our trustees. This sustained activity has no doubt tended to confirm me, in the minds of many AAS, as a continuing fact and symbol of AA leadership worldwide. This is the last remainder of my service leadership. For this action there are excellent and even compelling reasons. The basic one is the present need to strictly apply AA's tradition to every area of our world service operation. This means that I should no longer act in service leadership for the group conscience of AA. This must now become fully the function of our trustees, as guided by the conference delegates. Consider, too, AA's very healthy tradition of rotating leadership. Everywhere today this is a strictly applied principle excepting to me. This is a leftover inconsistency that ought to be eliminated by my own retirement to the sidelines, where practically all of AA's old-timers now are. But this is not all. My continued activity at AA's headquarters may be covering up unforeseen flaws in our organizational structure. These should be given an opportunity to reveal themselves, if they exist. Moreover, the excellent leadership that we now have among the trustees and in the headquarters should be allowed to operate without further collaboration with me. We know that, in the long run, double-headed management is highly unsound. My retirement from active service would cure this defect. There are also psychological reasons of the deepest import. AA is very much a family, of which we elders have surely been the spiritual parents. Now the parent who quits before his family has arrived at the age of responsibility, has unquestionably forsaken his trust. But the parent who far overstays his time can be extremely damaging, too. If he insists on continuing his parental authority and the protective custody of his wards well after they have reached the age of responsibility, he is simply robbing them of the priceless privilege of facing life on their own. What was perfectly right for their infancy and adolescence becomes strictly no good for their maturity. So the wise parent always changes his status accordingly. Of course he is still one who, if asked, will lend a hand in serious emergencies. But he knows that he simply must let his heirs make and repair most of their own mistakes, live their own lives, and grow up. Tradition 2 of the AA program deeply recognizes this universal truth when it declares, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God, as he may express himself in our group conscience. Of course I am not suggesting a complete withdrawal, I propose only to change my relationship with AA. For example, I expect to be available at trustee and conference meetings. Should marked defects appear in our present service structure, I shall, if asked, be very happy to aid in the work of repair. In short, I expect to be on tap but never again on top, this being precisely the stance that AA hopes all its old-timers will take. My coming shift to the sidelines will necessarily involve other changes. Save for the possibility of a future visit or two overseas, and my attendance at whatever international conventions there may be, I think that my days of traveling and speaking are over. Practically speaking, it is no longer possible for me to respond to the hundreds of invitations that now come in. It is very clear, too, that continued appearances would increase my prominence in AA at the very time when this should greatly diminish. There is much the same situation respecting my very large correspondence, which has grown so far out of hand that I can no longer do it justice. Nevertheless, one primary channel of communication still stands wide open: my writing for the Grapevine. This I would certainly like to continue. Just now, for example, I'm doing a series of articles entitled Practicing These Principles in All Our Affairs. Maybe these pieces can later be expanded into a full-sized book which would try to deal with the whole problem of living, as seen by us AAs. If it turns out that I can write it, such a volume might be of permanent value. There is another factor that bears upon my decision. Like every AA member, I have a definite responsibility to become a citizen of the world around me, to channel into it the experience of living and working which has been mine in our fellowship. Therefore, I'm already exploring certain areas of outside activity in which I may be able to make a helpful, and possibly a meaningful, contribution. For the first time, I now feel at liberty to follow the constructive example already set by uncounted numbers of my fellow members. But, of course, my principal reason for taking this new direction is the deep and confident belief that this will prove to be in the best long-time interest of Alcoholics Anonymous. It scarce needs be said that I approach this new crossroad for AA and for me with a lump in my throat, and with a heart very full of gratitude for all those unexampled privileges and gifts with which I have so long been blessed. Responsibility is our theme. July 1965. Marking AA's 30th year, we shall, in this month of July 1965, hold our international convention at Toronto. It is most fitting that the chosen keynote for this gala occasion will be AA's responsibility. There we shall review the 3 decades of AA life that are now history. Stirred by gratitude beyond expression, we shall give thanks to God whose grace has made it possible for us to achieve the quality of responsibility, individual and collective, that has brought our fellowship into its present state of well-being and worldwide reach. Looking back through the years, we shall be unable to conceive more than a mere fraction of what God has wrought among us. None will be able to imagine the sum of the suffering that was once ours, or the misery borne by those near and dear. Who will really understand the inner nature of our transforming spiritual experiences, those gifts of God, that open to us a new world of being and doing and living? Indeed, our blessings have been quite beyond any human comprehension. At our international gathering, we shall look into new faces. Many from afar will be heard to speak in other tongues. We shall see that the sun never sets upon AA's fellowship, that 350,000 of us have now recovered from our malady, that we have everywhere begun to transcend those formidable barriers of race, creed, and nationality. This assurance that so many of us have been able to meet our responsibilities for sobriety and for growth and effectiveness in the troubled world where we live, will surely fill us with the deepest joy and satisfaction. But as a people who have nearly always learned the hard way, we shall certainly not congratulate ourselves. We shall perceive these assets to be God's gifts, which have been in part matched by an increasing willingness on our part to find and do His will for us. Then we shall remember, too, how the pains of our illness literally drove us to what for most of us was the first responsible act of years, that of joining AA. Alcoholism had literally lashed us to such a point of collapse that we became willing to do whatever was necessary to get well. It was a matter of life or death. Thus propelled, we finally did join the AA fellowship, and there had our first glimpse of its quite new world of understanding and loving concern. Soon we took a look at AA's 12 steps for recovery, but many of us promptly forgot 10 of them, as perhaps not needed. We bought only the concept that we were alcoholics, that attendance at meetings and a helping hand to the newcomers would be sufficient to solve the booze problem, and probably all problems. We looked with approval on that dear old cliché which says that drinking is but a good man's fault. Once off the grog, life should be as pleasant as eating cherries. By happily warming our hands at the AA fire, all seemed well. But by degrees certain dissatisfaction set in, even with our own group. It was not as wonderful as we had first supposed. There was, perhaps, some rock throwing at a scandal, or a distressing row over who would become the group's next chair. There were people we simply did not like, and the ones we did admire failed to give us the attention we thought we deserved. At home we were also shocked. After the pink cloud had departed from the household, things seemed as bad as ever. The old wounds weren't healing at all. Though impressed with our sobriety, the bank nevertheless asked when were we going to pay up. Our boss likewise demanded in firm tones that we get with it. So each of us looked up his sponsor and regaled him with these woes. Our resentments, anxieties, and depressions were definitely caused, we claimed, by our unfortunate circumstances and by the inconsiderate behavior of other people. To our consternation, our sponsors didn't seem impressed either. They had just grinned and said, "Why don't we sit down and take a hard look at all of AA's 12 steps? Maybe you have been missing a lot, in fact, nearly everything." Then we began to take our own inventories, rather than the other fellows. Getting into the swing of self-examination, we finally began to discover our real responsibilities toward ourselves and toward those around us. Though a tough assignment, it did by degrees get easier. We began to make restitution to those we had harmed, grudgingly at first, and then more willingly. Little by little, we found that all progress, material or spiritual, consisted of finding out what our responsibilities actually were and then proceeding to do something about them. These activities began to pay off. We found that we didn't always have to be driven by our own discomforts as, more willingly, we picked up the burdens of living and growing. Then, most surprisingly, we discovered that full acceptance and action upon any clear-cut responsibility almost invariably made for true happiness and peace of mind. Moreover, these durable satisfactions were redoubled when we realized that our now better quality of willingness made it possible in meditation to find God's will. At last we discovered that we joyfully wanted to live responsibly. Such has been the course of spiritual unfoldment in AA, our pilgrim's progress, if you like. As it has been with each AA member, so it has been with each group, and with AA as a whole. I have often seen our society timid and fearful, angry and prideful, apathetic and indifferent. But I have also seen these negatives fade as the lessons of experience were learned and gladly applied. Let us recall a few instances. In the early days, we were so timid that we were sure AA should be a secret society. We shunned publicity because we still labored under the stigma of alcoholism, also because we might be overwhelmed by an influx of so-called undesirable people. We have often been angered at criticism from within and from the outside world. We have generally been far better at dishing out criticism than taking it. Sometimes we have boasted of AA as the know-all and do-all of alcoholism, so alienating our friends. Quite understanding the perils of accumulated wealth, we have converted the sphere into an alibi for failing to meet our trivial group, intergroup, and world service expenses, those vital arms of service so indispensable to carrying AA's message into the world about us. By poor sponsorship we have sometimes failed the needs of newly arrived sufferers. Then at certain great turning points of our history, we have, in anger or sheer indifference, backed away from what should have been clearly visible responsibilities. Disastrous results were on a few occasions barely averted. Old-timers can recall that the book Alcoholics Anonymous might never have been printed because some avowed that we did not need it, while others shrank from the risks of preparing that invaluable text. There was a great outcry against formation of the General Service Conference of Alcoholics Anonymous, that indispensable body of delegates which today links our society with the AA trustees of our world services. There was almost no belief that such a linkage could be effectively forged. Even an attempt at such a project would ruin us, many thought. In consequence, this utterly vital undertaking nearly fell by the wayside from the sheer burden of indifference, heavy attack, and little faith. Yet, in God's time, our spiritual assets have invariably come to exceed even such large liabilities. A recovery goes forward on a large scale. Practice of AA's 12 traditions has amazingly cemented our unity. Our intergroup associations and our General Service Conference have made possible a wide spreading of our message, at home and abroad. Our pains and our necessities first called us reluctantly to responsibility. But in the latter years, a joyous willingness and a confident faith have more and more permeated all the affairs of our fellowship. Despite this happy transcendence of the difficulties of yesterday and of today, we nevertheless deeply realize that our negative traits are still with us, and always will be. Therefore our constant responsibility should be that of taking a fearless inventory of our defects as we go along, the better to undertake their mending. At Toronto, we shall therefore be asking ourselves, what sort of heritage are we leaving, for the use of all those future generations that will people our society? Is this heritage as good as we can make it? While there is yet time, what can we still do that may multiply our assets and decrease our liabilities? In so surveying our society of today, I hope that I shall not be regarded as the wise and righteous elder who would admonish and exhort his fellows. If I inventory AA's shortcomings, be also assured that I am also taking stock of my own. I know that my errors of yesterday still have their effect, that my shortcomings of today may likewise affect our future. So it is, with each and all of us. Therefore, let us together take a look at the more important areas in the life of our fellowship where the call for improvement will always be insistent. Our first concern should be with those sufferers that we are still unable to reach. Let's first humbly realize that throughout the world of today there are 20 million alcoholics, 5 million of these being in the United States alone. Of course, these vast numbers are in all stages of sickness. Some cannot be reached because they are not hurt enough, others because they are hurt too much. Many sufferers have mental and emotional complications that seem to foreclose their chances. Yet it would be conservative to estimate that at any particular time there are 4 million alcoholics in the world who are able, ready, and willing to get well if only they knew how. Clearly, all these sufferers need to know what alcoholism is and to recognize that they are so afflicted. Being thus readied, they need to be brought within our reach by every resource of public information and word of mouth that will tell them exactly what steps they can take in finding the road to recovery. When we remember that in the 30 years of AA's existence, we have reached less than 10% of those who might have been willing to approach us, we begin to get an idea of the immensity of our task and of the responsibilities with which we will always be confronted. These facts point straight to our next responsibility, that of intelligently and lovingly sponsoring each man and woman who comes among us asking help. The care and concern with which we individually and collectively do this can make all the difference. Besides, this is the greatest expression of gratitude that we can give for what we ourselves have received. Without much doubt, 1 million alcoholics have approached AA during the last 30 years. We can soberly ask ourselves what became of the 600,000 who did not stay. How much and how often did we fail all these? In no circumstances should we feel that Alcoholics Anonymous is the know-all and do-all of alcoholism. We have in the United States and Canada alone perhaps 100 agencies engaged in research, alcohol education, and rehabilitation. Research has already come up with significant and helpful findings, and can still do far more. Those engaged in education are carrying the message that alcoholism is a definite illness and that something can be done about it. All these workers can make our efforts more effective. It is a statistical fact that rehabilitation agencies in the United States and Canada treat something like 50,000 alcoholics annually. True, their approach is often different from our own. But what does that matter, when the greater part of them are, or could become, entirely willing to cooperate with AA? Too often, I think, we have deprecated and even derided these projects of our friends just because we do not always see eye to eye with them. We should very seriously ask ourselves how many alcoholics have gone on drinking simply because we have failed to cooperate in good spirit with these many agencies, whether they be good, bad, or indifferent. No alcoholic should go mad or die me-rely because he did not come straight to AA at the beginning. Now let's look at the matter of criticism of AA that is made in the world about us. For years AA has been amazingly exempt from those barbs which society pitches at all endeavors of any consequence, whether they be social, medical, religious, or political. So we register surprise, shock, and anger when people find fault with AA. We are apt to be disturbed to such an extent that we cannot benefit by constructive criticism. Nor are we able to be good-natured about criticism which isn't so good. While these attitudes are not general among us, it is nevertheless a fact that many AAs do so react when they are hit where they live. Surely this sort of resentment makes no friends and achieves no constructive purpose. Certainly this is an area in which we can improve. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religion, nor is it a medical treatment, nor does it profess expertise in respect of unconscious motivations for behavior. These are facts all too often overlooked. Here and there we hear our members proclaiming AA as the great new religion. Except for strictly sobering up operations, we are also apt to underrate medical contributions to our welfare. The fact that psychiatry does not yet sober up many alcoholics sometimes inclines us to think in unflattering terms of that profession. Again, we are forgetting that to religion and to the medical arts we owe our very existence. In its cardinal principles and attitudes, AA has made great use of all of these resources. It is chiefly our friends who first gave us the principles and attitudes that enable us to live and to move today. Therefore, the credit of all these vital contributors should stand aces high among us. Certainly we drunks did put AA together, but all of its basic components were supplied by others. Here, especially, our maxim should be, let's be friendly with our friends. It is an historical fact that practically all groupings of men and women tend to become more dogmatic, their beliefs and practices harden and sometimes freeze. This is a natural and almost inevitable process. All people must, of course, rally to the call of their convictions, and we of AA are no exception. Moreover, all people should have the right to voice their convictions. This is good principle and good dogma. But dogma also has its liabilities. Simply because we have convictions that work well for us, it becomes very easy to assume that we have all the truth. Whenever this brand of arrogance develops, we are certain to become aggressive. We demand agreement with us, we play God. This isn't good dogma, it's very bad dogma. It could be especially destructive for us of AA to indulge in this sort of thing. Newcomers are approaching AA at the rate of tens of thousands yearly. They represent almost every belief and attitude imaginable. We have atheists and agnostics. We have people of nearly every race, culture, and religion. In AA we are supposed to be bound together in the kinship of a common suffering. Consequently, The full individual liberty to practice any creed or principle or therapy whatever should be a first consideration for us all. Let us not, therefore, pressure anyone with our individual or even our collective views. Let us instead accord each other the respect and love that is due to every human being as he tries to make his way toward the light. Let us always try to be inclusive rather than exclusive. Let us remember that each alcoholic among us is a member of AA, so long as he or she so declares. Some of our more obvious perils will always attach to money, to controversies within AA, and to the ever-present temptation to scramble within AA and outside it for distinction, prestige, and even power. The world around us is today shattered by these untoward forces. As drinkers we have been more subject to these forms of destruction than most other people. Here, thank God, we do have, and I trust we shall continue to have, a tremendous amount of awareness of our responsibilities for improvement. However, the fear of these forces should not deceive us into absurd rationalizations. In the fear of accumulated wealth and bureaucracy, we should not discover an alibi for failure to pay AA's legitimate service expenses. For fear of controversy, our leadership should not go timid when lively debate and forthright action is a necessity. And for fear of accumulating prestige and power, we should never fail to endow our trusted leaders with proper authority to act for us. Let us never fear needed change. Certainly we have to discriminate between changes for worse and changes for better. But once a need becomes clearly apparent in an individual, a group, or in AA as a whole, it has long since been found out that we cannot stand still and look the other way. The essence of all growth is a willingness to change for the better and then an unremitting willingness to shoulder whatever the responsibility. In conclusion, it is only fair to say that we of AA have been able in most areas of our lives together to make substantial gains in both our willingness and our capability for the acceptance and discharge of responsibility, something that our great gathering in Toronto will symbolize and demonstrate. As we look into the future, we clearly see that an ever greater willingness will certainly be the key to that progress which God intends for us as we move toward His appointed destiny. The Guidance of AA's World Affairs, January 1966. Speaking on behalf of AA's Board of Trustees, our devoted friend and chairman, Dr. Jack Norris, has called upon us to face a far-reaching responsibility. Future AA historians will no doubt record this occasion as a major turning point in the unfoldment of our well-loved fellowship. This is because we are now to reconsider, and perhaps to recast, the whole nature and composition of AA's future world leadership. As we meditate upon this long unresolved problem, it would be well to recall that in the affairs of new societies and of nations, the determination of their ultimate leadership has ever been a matter of crucial importance. This is the teaching of all human history. Dr. Jack has specifically requested us of Alcoholics Anonymous at the level of our Board of Trustees to assume the primary role in the conduct of AA's world affairs. He has presented a detailed program for achieving this, a plan almost unanimously recommended by his fellow trustees. Should we adopt this new concept in 1966, the chief responsibility for the guidance of our world affairs would then be shifted from the non-alcoholics of our present board to the alcoholic trustees of the new board. Our recast board would then be composed of 14 AA trustees and 7 non-alcoholic trustees. 7 of the AA members would be chosen from suitable areas of the United States and Canada on the basis of their AA leadership qualifications. The remaining 7 AAs would be selected on the basis of their several high standards of business, professional, and administrative skills. This would add up to a balanced board of 21 members, in which the AAS would function in a majority of 2-1. That would compare with our present board of 10 non-alcoholics and 9 AAS. The chief posts of the new board would be open to its AA members at any time such a change might be desirable. For practical reasons alone, the improved balance between the 3 classes of trustees should commend itself to us all. However, the trustees' plan, as outlined by Dr. Jack, has far greater implications than mere practicality, It carries deep spiritual values, it is a call to the highest of A's responsibilities. In effect, it is also a declaration that A has now evolved to such a point of stability and competence that it should no longer need to function under what has been, since 1938, the symbol of protective custody by non-alcoholic friends. As you know, the present structure was created long ago in a time when AA had but 3 groups and only 40 members. It is worth pausing here to recall why our General Service Board was originally so constituted. For us of AA, the year 1938 was one of anguished uncertainty. There was no proof that alcoholics could stay sober indefinitely. Nor was there convincing evidence that we had the emotional stability to look after ourselves, even though sober. Besides, we had no public standing, people did not even know that we existed. Then, too, how many distant AA groups would think of sending their money contributions to a board of trustees composed wholly of New York alcoholics? This was the climate of fear and indecision that darkly overcast us in that early time. Nevertheless, it had already become clear that our infant society would have to head up somewhere. At the top of our growing pyramid of membership, there would need to be erected a beacon light whose illumination might carry A's message to those who still suffered from alcoholism. Lest one day its radiance be snuffed out by drinking relapses and irresponsibility, we felt sure that we dare not tend this lighthouse all by ourselves. Some kind of certain protection we must have, but what protection? The answer that we proposed in 1938 is now history. We requested carefully chosen non-alcoholic friends to become a majority of our projected trusteeship, and we agreed to make this status legal. We further stipulated that, traditionally, there should always be a non-alcoholic chairman and likewise a non-alcoholic treasurer. Frankly admitting that A would absolutely have to have such a protectorate, we somberly estimated that, should all the A trustees get drunk, our board could nevertheless continue to function by reason of its non-alcoholic guardianship. Happily, we can now smile at all these excessive fears and elaborate precautions. During the past 27 years, only 2 A trustees have been waylaid by alcohol. Meanwhile, our message has been carried worldwide, and most effectively indeed. It is probably no exaggeration to estimate that 1/2 of our present membership and much of our remarkable unity has been due, in large measure, to the efforts of A World servants, both on the Board of Trustees and in the General Service Office. Of course, we have sometimes witnessed emotional storms, but none more serious than those which afflict most other societies. In every single instance these disturbances have been successfully overcome by the immense spirit of dedication that has always characterized every level of our worldwide effort. The record speaks for itself. Today we know that we need not fear alcoholism, nor excessive emotional instability. Next, let us inquire into what has been the value of our non-alcoholic trustees over all these years. Without hesitation, I can tell you that their value has been quite beyond reckoning. Only God could add their score. Therefore I deeply hope that a sizable contingent of these friends will continue to remain with us, just as our new plan provides. In the days when AA was unknown, it was the non-alcoholic trustees who held up our hands before the general public. They supplied us with ideas that are now a part of the working structures of our headquarters. They voluntarily spent hours on end, working side by side with us and among the grubbiest of details. They gave freely of their professional and financial wisdom. Now and then they helpfully mediated our difficulties. In the early years especially, their very presence on our board was quite able to command full confidence and the respect of many faraway groups. Meanwhile, they assured the world around us of A's worth. These are the unusual services which indeed they still render. Then, too, these are the men who stood fast during that exciting but perilous time between 1940 and 1950 when A's unity and its collective responsibility were put to the acid test. At time our 12 traditions were being forged out of the lessons of that experience. Having myself been a constant resident of A's House of World Service for over a quarter of a century, No one could better understand what these devoted friends have meant to us. To gratefully set my testimony of their magnificent contributions on the record in this article is something for the deepest and most enduring of satisfactions. Nor could any expression of our gratitude be complete unless I were to tell you of the indispensable contribution that was once made to AA's welfare by a non-alcoholic friend and trustee. I write of a man that many of you know, our one-time chairman, Mr. Bernard Smith. During the most serious crisis that this fellowship has ever experienced, it was Bern who persuaded us to meet and to shoulder our clear and rightful obligations. As individuals, it must be confessed that we AAS have never been over-anxious to meet heavy responsibilities. All of us were at first driven to AA under the lash of alcohol. Arriving in the midst of the newfound life, we were soon confronted with the 12 steps and 12 traditions. More often than not, we proceeded to adopt these principles in a rather piecemeal fashion. However, as inevitably time went by, the quality of our conformity began to improve. We commenced to practice AA principles because we knew them to be right for us, even though many were still difficult. Nonetheless, it was a very long time before many of us could come to the point where we would accept our heavier obligations with that full and joyful willingness which finally grants to us a consistent spiritual effectiveness. It is also observable that, like other people, we AAS are apt to resist any proposal for great change, especially when all seems to go well. Often enough, these reluctances have been based upon our fears. But sometimes they have represented a genuine prudence. This latter quality of conservatism has occasionally prevented ill-considered or hasty decisions upon important matters. What has been true of us as individuals has necessarily been true of AA as a whole. I can vividly remember the heavy opposition to the creation of our World Trusteeship in 1938, to the publication of our textbook Alcoholics Anonymous in 1939, and I still tremble when I recall the truly fierce resistance that arose when, in 1946, the General Service Conference of Alcoholics Anonymous was first projected. In those times it was seriously believed by a majority of AAS that the temptations and risks of such complex ventures as these would be far too much for us. However, we can now thank God that we finally did face and accept those vital and clear-cut responsibilities. Nevertheless, we found on each of these occasions that we had to be strongly persuaded of the absolute need for change. There had to be manifest a solid core of constructive and convincing personal leadership. This is exactly what our remarkable friend, Bern Smith, gave to us when, in 1950, after years of great heat but little light, we had failed to arrive at a decision to form AA's General Service Conference. It was his personal leadership that saved the day. Let me now background this statement. By 1946, certain facts of AA life were becoming visible. Our trusteeship, then called the Alcoholic Foundation, was becoming more and more isolated as our groups fanned out over the globe. Indeed, the only linkage between our board and all these thousands of members consisted of a few tireless AAS at the General Service Office, Dr. Bob, and myself. The trustees themselves were virtually unknown. Dr. Bob had fallen ill, perhaps fatally. Our linkage was perishable and far too thin. Hence some of us felt it imperative that our board of trustees should be directly related without delay to AA as a whole. There was still another reason. A majority of our groups had already declared that they would no longer live under the protection and management of their local founders and old-timers, no matter how well loved these were. For better or worse, our groups were taking the decision to look after themselves. This was the AA revolution which led to the writing of Tradition 2, whose principles of AA function provide that the group conscience shall be the final authority for all active services and that trusted servants named by the groups shall act in their behalf. Certainly our long-isolated board members were trusted servants. But it was nonetheless true that these trustees had no direct connection to the group conscience of our society, nor were they directly accountable to it. It was therefore becoming evident that we here at New York were still operating as a protectorate, something that had by then become obsolete and quite inconsistent with the provisions and spirit of A's second tradition. Consequently, it was proposed to assemble a general service conference of delegates who could squarely meet these deficiencies. As news of this project got into circulation, resistance began to mount. The more the conference was urged, the more the opposition dug in. Many AAS were deeply frightened. They imagined themselves engulfed in a wave of prestige-seeking, shabby politics, financial troubles, and all the rest of it. Under such conditions, many good members were quite unable to see the urgent need for radical change. Observing their protests, our board naturally concluded that AAS most emphatically did not want a general service conference. I'm afraid, too, that the growing impasse was made still worse by my incessant bulldozing of the conference issue. Then Burns Smith came upon the scene. With matchless diplomacy and tact he began to point out that the actual risk of the conference venture was, in his belief, far less than the risk of doing nothing at all, a policy which he thought would, in the future, result in a collapse or certainly a grievous impairment of AA at its very heart of service. He deeply felt that we must not risk such a debacle at our headquarters, a calamity from which we might never recover. He also continued to remind us that self-direction was the very first responsibility of every democratic society, such as ours had said it was in tradition too. As we know, these views of Burns were finally accepted, and I shall never forget that wonderful day in his office when the Trustees Committee on Structure recommended immediate creation of the General Service Conference of AA. To our friend Burn we therefore owe it that we have our annual conference. Certainly his story has a deep and clear relevance to this all-important matter of AA's future leadership, the question that is again before us and one which has been 10 years under debate. It is ever so evident that Dr. Jack has been performing for us a similar service of unique importance. To him and to his fellow trustees, we therefore owe a similar tribute. It is greatly due to Dr. Jack's wise and patient leadership in this time of change that we have the trustees' plan before us at this time, a plan which, if adopted, would mark the last basic step in the evolution of AA's world service structure. Most assuredly, I hardly need say that I do endorse the trustees' plan. Its unfoldment in the 1965 conference was one of the most inspiring and heartwarming events of my entire AA life. Finally, let us reflect together upon the high spiritual content of this all-important plan. As we know, all AA progress can be reckoned in terms of just two words: humility and responsibility. Our whole spiritual development can be accurately measured by our degree of adherence to these magnificent standards. Ever-deepening humility, accompanied by an ever greater willingness to accept and to act upon clear-cut obligations, these are truly are touchstones for all growth in the life of the Spirit. They hold up to us the very essence of right being and right doing. It is by them that we are enabled to find and to do God's will. Let us therefore consider the spiritual gifts which our friends have today offered for AA's future welfare. They have offered to reduce their numbers by 3. Being still a board majority, and still holding its chief posts, our non-alcoholics have all these years been cast in the role of guardianship, a responsibility that they have never been called upon to meet. Therefore this old-time symbol of protection has long since become meaningless. Recognizing this, the new trustees' plan provides that our friends would, in the future, act in a minority, thus becoming our associates. In making this humble offer, they have called upon us to assume the highest of responsibilities, the guidance, under God, of our own life as a fellowship. If this, then, is their demonstration of humility, what is going to be our demonstration of responsibility? As to a family just coming of age, they have in substance told us, the world of the future stretches before you, and you are well prepared. Go out into it, fearing nothing. Our faith in you is confident and strong. As you move onward toward your destiny, may you always remember that God in His wisdom has granted you 3 precious graces: freedom from a deadly affliction, a life experience that enables you to carry that priceless freedom to others, and a vision, ever widening, of God's reality and of His love. May we of Alcoholics Anonymous remain ever worthy of these three gifts of grace and of the supreme responsibilities that are now ours, for so long as a bountiful God may wish to endure. First World Service Meeting, October 1969. Surely the time will come when our overseas AA population may well exceed that of the United States and Canada. In the Third Legacy Manual, now the AA Service Manual, and in other writings, the principle has already been enunciated that the General Service Office in New York should one day become the senior service center among a number of national and zonal offices around the globe. This attitude has already been of immense value in forwarding our effort overseas. It has banished all possible suspicion that GSO in New York is going to run the whole world of AA. It is obvious that we cannot actually manage and conduct public information and relations with medicine and religion in South Africa, Australia, the British Isles, or anywhere else, for that matter. In the area of literature, distribution centers are needed that take into account both language and shipping problems. We are too remote to do these jobs, and for psychological reasons we should never make the attempt. But we can help by sharing with other countries the 30-year history and experience of GSO. AA is taking a giant step toward worldwide AA unity in New York, October 9 to 11, 1969. The First World Service Meeting will be held for these 3 days, bringing 26 delegates from 12 countries overseas, the Zone of Central America, and the North American Conference. These delegates will sit in sharing conferences in New York with trustees on the General Service Board and the staffs of GSO and the Grapevine. This meeting is, of course, undertaken with the approval of our General Service Board, the North American Conference, and the boards or committees of all participating countries. The objectives of the World Service Meeting are: 1. To consider the future development of world services, 2. To strengthen general service work already existing abroad, 3. To increase the number of service centers, 4. To provide for them an orderly plan of evolution, 5. To assist in strengthening their self-support. We welcome our delegate friends from around the world as we join together to assure that help will always be available for sick alcoholics wherever they are or whatever language they speak. Segment 3. Additional writings from this period: The Antidote for Fear, Prudence, Trust, and Faith, November 1959. This conference opened on the keynotes of prudence, trust, and faith, and its proceedings have been characterized by these attitudes and practices throughout. Confidence has therefore abounded among us, and in this year's session we have gone nearly scot-free of any worry or fear. Indeed, we have gone along so quietly that we have rather missed the usual excitements of hot debate and viewing with alarm for the good of the movement. But there has been an excitement nevertheless, a healthier excitement of quite another quality and kind. For instance, I found a most satisfying excitement as I watched the real eagerness, discipline, and dedication with which this assembly has waited for days through a great pile of humdrum but very necessary routine work. It made me most happy when I heard you delegates pay repeated and grateful tributes to the folks back home, to those hundreds of committee members and thousands of general service representatives whose combined labor had been, and always must be, the final foundation on which our whole world service structure and effort can securely rest. AA service leadership, you said, was not for delegates and trustees alone, it had to be out there in the grassroots, and it already was there. Then, too, we have all been gladdened by reports from nearly every quarter of our fellowship to the effect that confidence and real trust in our world services and servants has been much on the increase, that the fears of other days have almost evaporated. These are some of the newer and healthier excitements that we have felt in this notable conference of 1959. Fresh in memory is that great big laugh we had when one of you delegates, addressing me, rose and said, "Bill, we all heard you give that convincing pitch on trust and faith the night we got here. Now what would you say if I told you that out in our country we have a member who was supposed to be acting as our treasurer for a pretty large and important meeting, that the minute the tickets were sold and the money was banked, he developed a terrific thirst, drew out all that dough, and took off on a traveling wingding that blazed a cross-country trail 1,000 miles long. We all remember how our fellow delegates grinned as he spoke and how we roared with mirth as he finished. Now there was a time, years back, when such a thirsty and absconding treasurer could have shattered our confidence wholesale. How well I remember the first one. I can remember, too, my own shock and chagrin when one of my best friends attacked me unmercifully because he didn't like the way I was acting. I remember those first breaks of anonymity at the top public level and all of the fear and violent controversy that followed in their wake. Such were the alarms of A's early time. We feared we couldn't stay sober, we feared our group couldn't survive, we really feared that A might collapse completely. But how times have changed. What was once a big fear is today a big laugh. Take that one about the erring treasurer. In it I think we can find some wonderful things. Let it be recalled that in that laugh there wasn't a trace of contempt or anger. There wasn't the slightest thought of punishment, and I'll wager that not one soul here would have thought to call him a thief. Underneath that laugh there was sympathetic understanding, there was the realization that any one of us was still capable of an equal folly. Because we understood so well, we could forgive lightly and easily. Of course, we were laughing at the startled and penniless convention as it heard the bad news. But I think our laugh had a far deeper meaning than this. In reality, I'm sure we were laughing at ourselves, at our old and far-fetched fears. We were rejoicing because they had gone. Gone was the awful fear of what an individual's failure or behavior might do to us all. Gone was the long-time fear that the pressures and conflicts of the world around us might one day infiltrate and crush A. We laughed, I think, because we had no bondage to fear and felt free. We had ceased to doubt our collective safety and security. This brings me to another thought, another reason for reassurance. Of most nations and societies it seems true that their collective behavior has often been far worse than the individual behavior of their memberships. For example, few individuals in the world of today are hankering for war. Yet, many nations crave conquest and armed conflict. Nations notable for the individual honesty of their citizens will keep phony books, inflate their currencies, load their people with debts that can't be paid, and engage in all sorts of fraudulent propaganda and practices. Even the great religions, as organizations, have, quite contrary to their own teachings, sometimes gone in for a degree of violence and bigotry which the majority of their adherents would never have dreamed of imitating in their own personal lives. Mobs do all sorts of things that most of the individuals composing them would seldom do separately and on their own. While it's not for us to take a moral inventory of the world in any sense of pride or superiority, I do think it fair and timely to point out we AAS have thus far demonstrated a collective behavior probably much superior to our individual conduct. The whole, in our case, seems to be rather better than the sum of its individual parts. We are pretty much a bunch of power drivers. Yet AA, as a whole, has never quarreled with anybody. We like money for ourselves, but we keep our fellowship treasuries poor. We like prestige, yet we somehow remain anonymous. As individuals we are apt to be aggressive, yet our society as a whole is quite non-aggressive, minding its own business. In short, we are in a strange contrast to the world about us, and we devoutly hope we shall stay that way. In these perilous times this will be the sort of collective prudence that we shall constantly need. It will guarantee our effectiveness, safety, and survival as nothing else can. Our collective prudence respecting money, fame, and controversy derived of course from our 12 traditions has continued to make a new hosts of friends, and, just as importantly, no enemies. May this benign process never stop, within and without our fellowship. As this wonderful conference has so well shown, the absence of fear has made way for wisdom and prudence. Prudence has led us to confidence and trust and faith in our fellow man, faith in ourselves, and faith in God's love. Our critics can be our benefactors. April 1963. When a magazine criticizing aspects of AA raised questions about AA's relationships to medicine, religion, and the world at large, the Grapevine editors consulted Bill. He suggested a rereading of the following relevant portions of AA Comes of Age and 12 Concepts for World Service. As a society, we must never become so vain as to suppose that we have been the authors and inventors of a new religion. We will humbly reflect that each of AA's principles, every one of them, has been borrowed from ancient sources. We shall remember that we are laymen, holding ourselves in readiness to cooperate with all men of goodwill, whatever creed or nationality. Speaking for Dr. Bob and myself, I would like to say that there has never been the slightest intent, on his part or mine, of trying to found a new religious denomination. Dr. Bob held certain religious convictions, and so do I. This is, of course, the personal privilege of every AA member. Nothing, however, could be so unfortunate for AA's future as an attempt to incorporate any of our personal theological views into AA teaching, practice, or tradition. Were Dr. Bob still with us, I am positive he would agree that we could never be too emphatic about this matter. Then, too, it would be a product of false pride to believe that Alcoholics Anonymous is a cure-all, even for alcoholism. Here we must remember our debt to the men of medicine. Here we must be friendly and, above all, open-minded toward every new development in the medical or psychiatric art that promises to be helpful to sick people. We should always be friendly to those in the fields of alcoholic research, rehabilitation, and education. We should endorse none especially, but hold ourselves in readiness to cooperate so far as we can with them all. Let us constantly remind ourselves that the experts in religion are the clergymen, that the practice of medicine is for physicians, and that we, the recovered alcoholics, are their assistants. There are those who predict that Alcoholics Anonymous may well become a new spearhead for a spiritual awakening throughout the world. When our friends say these things, they are both generous and sincere. But we of AA must reflect that such a tribute and such a prophecy could well prove to be a heady drink for most of us, that is, if we really came to believe this to be the real purpose of AA, and if we commenced to behave accordingly. Our society, therefore, will prudently cleave to its single purpose, the carrying of the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Let us resist the proud assumption that since God has enabled us to do well in one area, we are destined to be a channel of saving grace for everybody. On the other hand, let us never be a closed corporation, let us never deny our experience for whatever it may be worth to the world around us. Let our individual members heed the call to every field of human endeavor. Let them carry the experience and spirit of AA into all these affairs, for whatever good they may accomplish. For not only has God saved us from alcoholism, the world has received us back into its citizenship. Yet, believing in paradoxes as we do, we must still realize that the more the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous as such tends to its own affairs and minds its own business, the greater will be our general influence, the less will be any opposition to us, and the wider will be the circle in which our fellowship will be likely to enjoy the confidence and respect of men. Alcoholics Anonymous comes of age. Now let us suppose that AA does fall under sharp public attack or heavy ridicule, and let us take the particular case where such pronouncements happen to have little or no justification in fact. Almost without exception, it can be confidently estimated that our best defense in these situations would be no defense whatever, namely, complete silence at the public level. Unreasonable people are stimulated all the more by opposition. If in good humor we leave them strictly alone, they are apt to subside the more quickly. If their attacks persist and it is plain that they are misinformed, it may be wise to communicate with them in a temperate and informative way, also in such a manner that they cannot use our communication as a springboard for fresh assault. Such communications need seldom be made by the conference officially. Very often we can use the good offices of friends. Such messages from us should never question the motives of the attackers, they should be purely informative. These communications should also be private. If made public, they will often be seized upon as a fresh excuse for controversy. If, however, a given criticism of AA is partly or wholly justified, it may be well to acknowledge this privately to the critics, together with our thanks. 12 Concepts for World Service. In the years ahead we shall, of course, make mistakes. Experience has taught us that we need have no fear of doing this, providing that we always remain willing to confess our faults and to correct them promptly. Our growth as individuals has depended upon this healthy process of trial and error. So will our growth as a fellowship. Let us always remember that any society of men and women that cannot freely correct its own faults must surely fall into decay if not into collapse. Such is the universal penalty for the failure to go on growing. Just as each AA must continue to take his moral inventory and act upon it, so must our whole society do if we are to survive and if we are to serve usefully and well. Alcoholics Anonymous comes of age. A message from Bill, May 1964. I'm glad indeed that we so often say to each other, faith without works is dead. Action is the magic word. As we strive to devise better ways of carrying the AA message to those who still suffer, I hope that we will also try to create a wider understanding of the operation and needs of AA's World Services, that all-important cluster of activities which enables our fellowship to function as a whole. Because these far-flung services reach into every quarter of the world, their direct influence for good is too often unseen, and therefore unknown. Without that global effort, we would now be in a most sorry and chaotic state. Let me illustrate this by 2 examples. Suppose, for instance, that, during the last 25 years, AA had never published any standard literature, no books, no pamphlets. We need little imagination to see that by now our message would be hopelessly garbled. Our relations with medicine and religion would have become a shambles. To alcoholics generally we would today be a joke, and the public would have thought us a riddle. Without its literature, AA would certainly have bogged down in a welter of controversy and disunity. Nevertheless, effective literature was prepared, and in 1939 the publication of the Big Book became our very first World Service. From that time on, it became perfectly clear what AA is, what it believes, and how it works. Millions of our pamphlets and hundreds of thousands of our books are today in circulation. AA's message can never be garbled. Anyone at all can find out about us with ease. What the dividends of this single project in world communication have been, only God Himself knows. One more illustration. Our fellowship enjoys a vast goodwill everywhere. In large measure this is directly due to another AA World Service, the service of public information. For many years wonderful accounts of AA have poured from the press and from other media of communication. This astounding success has required of your general service people great labor, top skills, and unstinted dedication. There is no question that this continued torrent of favorable publicity has brought to AA one-half its present membership. But just suppose that these great channels of communication had been left wide open to the winds of chance, or, worse still, had never been developed by us at all. Had there been such a failure, we may well shudder at the dire consequences. Tens of thousands of today's AA membership would still be drinking. Many indeed would now be mad or dead. I'm sure you have already seen that AA World Service is utterly necessary to our future unity and growth, even to our survival as a fellowship. To maintain these life-giving arteries of world communication in full flow, and in good repair, will always be a top priority task for each new generation of our society. This will require of us a greatly increased understanding of the immense need to be met, and a sustained devotion of the highest order. The world of today harbors the appalling total of 20 million alcoholic men and women. Without doubt a large fraction of these fellow sufferers could begin to find their sobriety and a new way of life if only they could see and hear just one AA meeting. Experience has already proved that our world services constitute the largest and the most powerful single agency that we shall ever possess to bring those legions of sufferers within reach of what we AAs around the world have so providentially discovered for ourselves. Knowing this fellowship, I feel entirely confident that we will eagerly shoulder and discharge well this most high responsibility to our third legacy. As we continue in the language of the heart to carry AA's message across all distances and all barriers, may God bless us. AA's Tradition of Self-Support, October 1967. AA's far-flung 12th step activities, carrying the message to the next sufferer, are the very lifeblood of our AA adventure. Without this vital activity, we would soon become anemic, we would literally wither and die. Now, where do AA services worldwide, area, local fit into our scheme of things? Why should we provide these functions with money? The answer is simple enough. Every single AA service is designed to make more and better 12th step work possible, whether it be a group meeting place, a central or intergroup office to arrange hospitalization and sponsorship, or the World Service headquarters to maintain unity and effectiveness all over the globe. Though not costly, these service agencies are absolutely essential to our continued expansion, to our survival as a fellowship. Their costs are a collective obligation that rests squarely upon all of us. Our support of services actually amounts to a recognition on our part that AA must everywhere function in full strength, and that, under our tradition of self-support, we are all going to foot the bill. We have long known that Alcoholics Anonymous has no need for charitable contributions from any source. Our fellowship is self-supporting. Neither do AA groups try to meet the rehabilitation expenses of thousands of newcomers. Long ago we learned that this was impractical. Instead, AA offers to the new person a spiritual way of life that can eliminate the alcohol problem. With this accomplished, the new person, in the company of his fellow sufferers, can then begin the solution of his personal problems, including the financial one. So AA groups themselves accept no charitable funds and give none away. At first glance, this attitude may seem to be hard-nosed, even callous. An immense experience tells us otherwise. Money gifts as a prerequisite of getting sober are usually worthless when made a function of an AA group. Of course, we see AA's primary charity in the 12th step activities of tens of thousands of us as we daily carry the AA message to newcomers. We travel millions of miles, we absent ourselves from business and home. In the aggregate, we lay out large sums. As individuals, we do not hesitate to give temporary financial aid to the newcomer, if and when he seems to want sobriety first. Here, then, is money charity aplenty, always given on a very personal, face-to-face basis. And perhaps even this cannot be called wholly charitable, since every 12th step effort means more certain sobriety and added spiritual growth for the sponsor. Both these principles we understand, that AA wants no charity, that we support our own services. We understand, but we sometimes forget. A Christmas Message, December 1970. Gratitude is just about the finest attribute we can have, and how deeply we of AA realize this at Christmas time. Together, we count and ponder our blessings of life, of service, of love. In these distraught times, we have been enabled to find an always increasing measure of peace within ourselves. Together with all here at AA's General Service Office, Lois joins me in warmest greetings to each and all of you, and we share our confident faith that the year to come will be counted among the best that our fellowship has ever known. Memorial Articles. N.S. July 1949. N.S. has taken her leave of us. She died on Wednesday, June 1st. To the hundreds who really knew her, this was a meaningful and moving event. With those who knew her not, I wish to share the inspiration which she gave to Lois and me. Anne was the wife of Dr. Bob, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. She was, quite literally, the mother of our first group, Akron No. 1. Her wise and beautiful counsel to all, her insistence that the spiritual come before anything else, her unwavering support of Dr. Bob in all his works, all these were virtues which watered the uncertain seed that was to become AA. Who but God could assess such a contribution? We can only say that it was priceless and magnificent. In the full sense of the word, she was one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Not a soul who knew and will say that she is really gone. Each knows that her abiding love and influence will live forever. And none knows better than Dr. Bob, Lois, and I, who saw these things from the beginning. Nor do we think we shall never see her again. For, like nearly all our fellow AA members, we believe there is no death. She is only out of our sight and hearing for a little while. Dr. Bob, a tribute January 1951. Serenely remarking to his attendant, "I think this is it," Dr. Bob passed out of our sight and hearing November 16, 1950 at noonday. So ended the consuming malady wherein he had so well shown us how high faith can rise over grievous distress. As he had lived, so he had died, supremely aware that in his Father's house are many mansions. In all those he knew, memory was at flood tide. But who could really say what was thought and felt by the 5,000 sick ones to whom he personally ministered and freely gave a physician's care? Who could possibly record the reflections of his townsmen who had seen him sink almost within the grasp of oblivion, then rise to anonymous world renown? Who could express the gratitude of those tens of thousands of AA families who had so well heard of him but had never seen him face to face? What, too, were the emotions of those nearest him as they thankfully pondered the mystery of his regeneration 15 years ago and all its vast consequence since? Not the smallest fraction of this great benefaction could be comprehended. He could only declare, "What indeed hath God wrought?" Never would Dr. Bobby have us think him saint or superman. Nor would he have us praise him or grieve his passing. He can almost be heard, saying, "Seems to me you folks are making heavy going. I'm not to be taken so seriously as all that. I was only a first link in that chain of providential circumstance which is called AA. By grace and great fortune my link did not break, though my faults and failures might often have brought on that unhappy result. I was just another alcoholic trying to get along under the grace of God. Forget me, but go you and do likewise. Securely add your own link to our chain. With God's help, forge that chain well and truly." In this manner would Dr. Bob estimate himself and counsel us. It was a Saturday in May 1935. An ill-starred business venture had brought me to Akron, where it immediately collapsed, leaving me in a precarious state of sobriety. That afternoon I paced the lobby of Akron's Mayflower Hotel. As I peered at the gathering crowd in the bar, I became desperately frightened of a slip. It was the first severe temptation since my New York friend had laid before me what were to become the basic principles of AA, in November 1934. For the next 6 months I had felt utterly secure in my sobriety. But now there was no security, I felt alone, helpless. In the months before I had worked hard with other alcoholics. Or, rather, I had preached at them in a somewhat cocksure fashion. In my false assurance I felt I couldn't fall. But this time it was different. Something had to be done at once. Glancing at a church directory at the far end of the lobby, I selected the name of a clergyman at random. Over the phone I told him of my need to work with another alcoholic. Though I'd had no previous success with any of them, I suddenly realized how such work had kept me free from desire. The clergyman gave me a list of 10 names. Some of these people, he was sure, would refer me a case in need of help. Almost running to my room, I seized the phone. But my enthusiasm soon ebbed. Not a person in the first 9 called could, or would, suggest anything to meet my urgency. One uncalled name still stood at the end of my list: Henrietta Seiberlin. Somehow I couldn't muster courage to lift the phone. But after one more look into the bar downstairs, something said to me, "You'd better." To my astonishment, a warm southern voice floated in over the wire. Declaring herself no alcoholic, Henrietta nonetheless insisted that she understood. Would I come to her home at once? Because she had been enabled to face and transcend other calamities, she certainly did understand mine. She was to become a vital link to those fantastic events which were presently to gather around the birth and development of our AA Society. Of all names the obliging rector had given me, she was the only one who cared enough. I would here like to record our timeless gratitude. Straight away, she pictured the plight of Dr. Bob and Ann. Suiting action to her word, she called their house. As Ann answered, Henrietta described me as a sobered alcoholic from New York who, she felt sure, could help Bob. The good doctor had seemingly exhausted all medical and spiritual remedies for his condition. Then Ann replied, "What you say, Henrietta, is terribly interesting. But I am afraid we can't do anything now. Being Mother's Day, my dear boy has just brought in a fine potted plant. The pot is on the table but, alas, Bob is on the floor. Could we try to make it tomorrow?" Henrietta instantly issued a dinner invitation for the following day. At 5 o'clock next afternoon, Ann and Dr. Bob stood at Henrietta's door. She discreetly whisked Bob and me off to the library. His words were, "Mighty glad to meet you, Bill. But it happens I can't stay long, 5 or 10 minutes at the outside." I laughed and observed, "Guess you're pretty thirsty, aren't you?" His rejoinder was, "Well, maybe you do understand this drinking business after all." So began a talk which lasted hours. How different my attitude was this time. My fright of getting drunk had evoked a much more becoming humility. After telling Dr. Bob my story, I explained how truly I needed him. Would he allow me to help him, I might remain sober myself. The seed that was to flower as I began to grow toward the light. But as dear and well guessed, that first tendril was a fragile thing. Practical steps had better be taken. She bade me come and live at their menage for a while. There I might keep an eye on Dr. Bob. And he might on me. This was the very thing. Perhaps we could do together what we couldn't do separately. Besides, I might revive my sagging business venture. For the next 3 months I lived with these two wonderful people. I shall always believe they gave me more than I ever brought them. Each morning there was devotion. After the long silence Ann would read out of the good book. James was our favorite. Reading him from her chair in the corner, she would softly conclude, "Faith without works is dead." But Bob's travail with alcohol was not quite over. That Atlantic City medical convention had to be attended. He hadn't missed one in 20 years. Anxiously waiting, Ann and I heard nothing for 5 days. Finally his office nurse and her husband found him early one morning at the Akron Railroad station in some confusion and disarray, which puts it mildly. A horrible dilemma developed. Dr. Bob had to perform a critical surgical operation just 3 days hence. Nor could an associate substitute for him. He simply had to do it. But how? Could we ever get him ready in time? He and I were placed in twin beds. A typical tapering down process was inaugurated. Not much sleep for anybody, but he cooperated. At 4 o'clock on the morning of the operation he turned, looked at me, and said, "I am going through with this." I inquired, "You mean you are going through with the operation?" He replied, "I have placed both the operation and myself in God's hands. I'm going to do what it takes to get sober and stay that way." Not another word did he say. At 9 o'clock he shook miserably as we helped him into his clothes. We were panic-stricken. Could he ever do it? Were he too tight or too shaky, it would make little difference, his misguided scalpel might take the life of his patient. We gambled. I gave him 1 bottle of beer. That was the last drink he ever took. It was June 10, 1935. The patient lived. Our first prospect appeared, a neighboring parson sent him over. Because the newcomer faced eviction, and took in his whole family, wife, and 2 children. The new one was a puzzler. When drinking, he'd go clean out of his mind. One afternoon Ann sat at her kitchen table, calmly regarding him as he fingered a carving knife. Under her steady gaze, his hand dropped. But he did not get sober then. His wife despairingly betook herself to her own parents and he disappeared. But he did reappear 15 years later for Dr. Bob's last rites. There we saw him, soundly and happily sober in AA. Back in 1935 we weren't so accustomed to miracles as we are today, we had given him up. Then came a lull on the 12th step front. In this time Anne and Henrietta infused much needed spirituality into Bob and me. Lois came to Akron on vacation from her grind at a New York department store, so raised our morale immensely. We began to attend Oxford group meetings at the Akron home of T. Henry Williams. The devotion of this good man and his wife is a bright page in memory. Their names will be inscribed on page 1 of A's book of First and Best Friends. One day Dr. Bob said to me, "Don't you think we'd better scare up some drunks to work on?" He phoned the nurse in charge of admissions at Akron City Hospital and told her how he and another drunk from New York had a cure for alcoholism. I saw the old boy blush and look disconcerted. The nurse had commented, "Well, doctor, you'd better give that cure a good work out on yourself." Nevertheless the admitting nurse produced a customer. A dandy, she said he was. A prominent Akron lawyer, he had lost about everything. He'd been in city hospital 6 times in 4 months. He'd arrived at that very moment, had just knocked down a nurse he'd thought was a pink elephant. "Will that one do you?" she inquired. Said Dr. Bob, "Put him in a private room. We'll be down when he's better." Soon Dr. Bob and I saw a sight which tens of thousands of us have since beheld, the sight of the man on the bed who does not yet know he can get well. We explained to the man on the bed the nature of his malady and told him our own stories of drinking and recovery. But the sick one shook his head. "Guess you've been through the mill, boys, but you never were half as bad off as I am. For me it's too late. I don't dare go out of here. I'm a man of faith, too, used to be deacon in my church. I've still faith in God, but I guess he hasn't got any in me. Alcohol has me, it's no use. Come and see me again, though. I'd like to talk with you more." As we entered his room for our second visit, a woman sitting at the foot of his bed was saying, "What has happened to you, husband? You seem so different. I feel so relieved." The new man turned to us. "Here they are," he cried. "They understand. After they left yesterday I couldn't get what they told me out of my mind, I lay awake all night. Then hope came. If they could find release, so might I. I became willing to get honest with myself, to square my wrongdoing, to help other alcoholics. The minute I did this I began to feel different. I knew I was going to be well." Continued the man on the bed, "Now, good wife, please fetch me my clothes. We are going to get up and out of here." Whereupon A number 3 arose from his bed, never to drink again. The seed of A had pushed another tendril up through the new soil. Though we knew it not, it had already flowered. 3 of us were gathered together. Akron's Group 1 was a reality. We 3 worked with scores of others. Many were called but mighty few chosen. Failure was our daily companion. But when I left Akron in September 1935, 2 or 3 more sufferers had apparently linked themselves to us for good. The next 2 years marked the flying blind period of our pioneering time. With the fine instinct of that good physician he was, Dr. Bob continued to medically treat and indoctrinate every new case, first at Akron City Hospital, then for the dozen years since at famed St. Thomas, where thousands passed under his watchful eye and sure a touch. Though not of his faith, the staff and sisters there did prodigies. Theirs is one of the most compelling examples of love and devotion we AAS have ever witnessed. Ask the thousands of AA visitors and patients who really know. Ask them what they think of Sister Ignatia, of St. Thomas, or of Dr. Bob. But I'm getting ahead of my story. Meanwhile a small group had taken shape in New York. The Akron meeting at T. Henry's home began to have a few Cleveland visitors. At this juncture I spent a week visiting Dr. Bob. We commenced to count noses. Out of hundreds of alcoholics, how many had stuck? How many were sober? And for how long? In that fall of 1937 Bob and I counted 40 cases who had significant dry time, maybe 60 years for the whole lot of them. Our eyes glistened. Enough time had elapsed on enough cases to spell out something quite new, perhaps something great indeed. Suddenly the ceiling went up. We no longer flew blind. A beacon had been lighted. God had shown alcoholics how it might be passed from hand to hand. Never shall I forget that great and humbling hour of realization, shared with Dr. Bob. But the new realization faced us with a great problem, a momentous decision. It had taken nearly 3 years to effect 40 recoveries. The United States alone probably had 1 million alcoholics. How were we to get the story to them? Wouldn't we need paid workers, hospitals of our own, lots of money? Surely we must have some sort of a textbook. Dare we crawl at a snail's pace whilst our story got garbled and mayhap thousands would die? What a poser that was! How we were spared from professionalism, wealth, and extensive property management, how we finally came up with the book Alcoholics Anonymous is a story by itself. But in this critical period it was Dr. Bob's prudent counsel which so often restrained us from rash ventures that might have retarded us for years, perhaps ruined us for good. Nor can we ever forget the devotion of Dr. Bob and Jim S., who passed away last summer, as they gathered stories for the AA book, 3/5 of them coming from Akron alone. Dr. Bob's special fortitude and wisdom were prime factors in that time so much characterized by doubt, and finally by grave decision. How much we may rejoice that N and Dr. Bob both lived to see the lamplit at Akron carried into every corner of the earth, that they doubtless realized millions might someday pass under the ever-widening arch whose keystone they so gallantly helped carve. Yet, being so humble as they were, I'm sure they never quite guessed what a heritage they left us, nor how beautifully their appointed task had been completed. All they needed to do was finished. It was even reserved for Dr. Bob to see AA come of age as, for the last time, he spoke to 7,000 of us at Cleveland, July 1950. I saw Dr. Bob the Sunday before he died. A bare month previous he had aided me in framing a proposal for the General Service Conference of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA's third legacy. This bequest, in pamphlet form, was actually at the printers when he took his final departure the following Thursday. As his last act and desire respecting AA, this document will be sure to carry a great and special meaning for us all. With no other person have I ever experienced quite the same relation. The finest thing I know how to say is that in all the strenuous time of our association, he and I never had an uncomfortable difference of opinion. His capacity for brotherhood and love was often beyond my ken. For a last word, may I leave with you a moving example of his simplicity and humility. Curiously enough, the story is about a monument proposed for him. A year ago, when N passed away, the thought of an imposing shaft came uppermost in the minds of many. People were insistent that something be done. Hearing rumors of this, Dr. Bob promptly declared against AA's erecting for N and himself any tangible memorial or monument. These usual symbols of personal distinction he brushed aside in a single devastating sentence. Said he, "Annie and I plan to be buried just like other folks. At the alcoholic ward in St. Thomas." His friends did, however, erect this simple plaque. It reads, "In gratitude, the friends of Dr. Bob N. Smith affectionately dedicate this memorial to the sisters and staff of St. Thomas Hospital." At Akron, birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous, St. Thomas Hospital became the first religious institution ever to open its door to our society. May the loving devotion of those who labored here in our pioneering time be a bright and wondrous example of God's grace everlastingly set before us all. He kept the faith. Bill D. November 1954. Bill D., AA number 3, died in Akron Friday night, September 17, 1954. That is, people say he died, but he really didn't. His spirit and works are today alive in the hearts of uncounted AAS, and who can doubt that Bill already dwells in one of those many mansions in the great beyond. 19 years ago last summer, Dr. Bob and I saw him for the first time. Bill lay on his hospital bed and looked at us in wonder. 2 days before this, Dr. Bob had said to me, "If you and I are going to stay sober, we had better get busy." Straight away, Bob called Akron City Hospital and asked for the nurse on the receiving ward. He explained that he and a man from New York had a cure for alcoholism. Did she have an alcoholic customer on whom it could be tried? Knowing Bob of old, she jokingly replied, "Well, doctor, I suppose you've already tried it yourself." Yes, she did have a customer, a dandy. He just arrived in DT's. Had blacked the eyes of 2 nurses, and now they had him strapped down tight. Would this one do? After prescribing medicines, Dr. Bob ordered, "Put him in a private room. We'll be down as soon as he clears up." We found we had a tough customer in Bill. According to the nurse, he had been a well-known attorney in Akron and a city councilman. But he had landed in the Akron City Hospital 4 times in the last 6 months. Following each release, he got drunk even before he could get home. So here we were, talking to Bill, the first man on the bed. We told him about our drinking. We hammered it into him that alcoholism was an obsession of the mind, coupled to an allergy of the body. The obsession, we explained, condemned the alcoholic to drink against his will, and the allergy, if he went on drinking, could positively guarantee his insanity or death. How to unhook that fatal compulsion, how to restore the alcoholic to sanity, was, of course, the problem. Hearing this bad news, Bill's swollen eyes opened wide. Then we took the hopeful tack. We told what we had done, how we got honest with ourselves as never before, how we had talked our problems out with each other in confidence, how we tried to make amends for harm done others, how we had then been miraculously released from the desire to drink as soon as we had humbly asked God, as we understood Him, for guidance and protection. Bill didn't seem too impressed. Looking sadder than ever, he wearily ventured, "Well, this is wonderful for you fellows, but can't be for me. My case is so terrible that I'm scared to go out of this hospital at all. You don't have to sell me religion, either. I was at one time a deacon in the church and I still believe in God. But I guess He doesn't believe much in me." Then Dr. Bob said, "Well, Bill, maybe you'll feel better tomorrow. Wouldn't you like to see us again?" "Sure I would," replied Bill, "maybe it won't do any good. But I'd like to see you both, anyhow. You certainly know what you are talking about." Looking in next day, we found Bill with his wife, Henrietta. Eagerly he pointed to us saying, "These are the fellows I told you about, they are the ones who understand." Bill then related how he had lain awake nearly all night. Down in the pit of his depression, new hope had somehow been born. The thought flashed through his mind, "If they can do it, I can do it." Over and over he said this to himself. Finally, out of this hope, there burst conviction. Now he was sure. Then came a great joy. At length peace stole over him and he slept. Before our visit was over, Bill suddenly turned to his wife and said, "Go fetch my clothes, dear. We're going to get up and get out of here." Bill D. walked out of that hospital a free man, never to drink again. AA's number 1 group dates from that very day. The force of the great example that Bill set in our pioneering time will last as long as AA itself. Bill kept the faith. What more could we say? Dr. A. Wisehammer, May 1957. This simple account of the passing of one of America's finest surgeons stirs memories that will always be bright in the annals of Alcoholics Anonymous. Dr. A.Y.'s Hammer was one of the best friends that AA will ever have. Several of Philadelphia's old-time members have written up the full story of Dr. Hammer and his benefactions. And here is the substance of what they had to say. It was February 1940. Jim, a New York AA, had just moved to Philadelphia and he was trying to get a local bookstore to carry the book Alcoholics Anonymous. The bookstore's manager protested that his customers could have no possible interest in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. As for himself, he couldn't care less. Overhearing this turn down, a lady standing nearby got into the act. She said she had sent Alcoholics Anonymous to her alcoholic nephew in Los Angeles. To the astonishment of the whole family, the problem boy had sobered up instantly and he had stayed that way for some 3 months. This was unheard of. Nevertheless, the bookstore manager remained unimpressed. But when Helen Hammer heard of Jim's attempt to start the group at Philadelphia, her delight was boundless. She immediately led Jim and one of his new prospects to her surgeon husband. Dr. Hammer in all that he undertook was a huge enthusiast. This full-blooded, ruddy-faced man had a zest for living which poured out of him right around the clock. And this joyous contagion he could spread to just about everybody he met. The moment he heard Jim's story about his good work for our society began at once. As we shall see, it was not confined to Philadelphia only. Dr. Hammer went to bat for us nationally at a time when AA had great need for this kind of good friend. Here is what Dr. Hammer did: opened his home to all AA members, secured the Philadelphia group its first meeting rooms, introduced us to Dr. Stauffer, another great friend to be, who was then chief psychiatrist at the Philadelphia General Hospital, secured us treatment and visiting privileges. There, had AAS speak before the County Medical Society, along with his good wife, Helen, attended nearly every AA meeting for years, gave free medical and surgical aid to every AA who wanted it, visited other cities to talk about AA and paid the expenses of the Philadelphia members he took along, offered to buy the Philadelphia group its first clubhouse, which had to be declined, saw that his friend, Judge Curtis Bach, owner of the Saturday Evening Post, became interested in AA, and finally induced the judge to assign Jack Alexander to do the famous article in 1941 that made our fellowship a national institution. This is only an abbreviated list of Dr. Hammer's good works for our society. Doubtless hundreds of his benefactions will never be known, except to those individual sufferers to whom he was so notably kind. Then, too, I find it impossible to write about Dr. Hammer without the happy recollection of Dr. Dudley Saul, another noted Philadelphia physician who constantly vied with Dr. Hammer in good works for us drunks. To our intense astonishment and always to our great benefit, these two great gentlemen fiercely competed with each other to figure out something bigger and better they could do for Alcoholics Anonymous. This is a great story in itself which I'm going to tell one of these days. How could AA in its infancy ever have survived without friends such as these Philadelphia physicians who worked shoulder to shoulder with Drs. Tybout and Silkworth at New York? To Helen Hammer I send AA's deepest sympathy and gratitude. And I often wonder what her memories of our early days must be. To Father Ed, Godspeed. June 1960. Early Sunday morning, April 3rd, Father Edward Dowling died peacefully in his sleep. The place was Memphis, Tennessee. Cheerfully unmindful of his ebbing health, he had been visiting one of his Cana groups. A favorite undertaking which he founded, Father Ed's Cana groups are dedicated, under church auspices, to the solution of difficult family problems through the practice of AA's 12 steps. Never was there a gayer evening than in the hours before. He would have wanted to take his leave of us in just that way. This was one of the most gentle souls and finest friends we AAS may ever know. He left a heritage of inspiration and grace, which will be with us always. Father Ed had planned to be at our 1960 Long Beach convention, come July. This prospect, now to be unfulfilled, brings a moving recollection of his appearance at AA's St. Louis International Convention of 1955. It seems altogether fitting that I repeat the introduction I then made of him, together with an account of the unforgettable impression he left upon me the very first time we met, a fragment of history recorded years afterward in A Comes of Age. With deep joy, I present to you Father Ed Dowling, who lives at the Jesuit house right here in St. Louis. Father Ed, knowing whence comes his strength, is definitely allergic to praise. Nonetheless, I think that certain facts about him should be put into our record, facts that new generations of AAS ought to hear, read, and know. Father Ed helped to start the first AA group in this town. He was the first clergyman of his faith to note the surprising resemblance between the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, founder of the Jesuit order, and the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. As a result, he was quick to write in 1940 the first Catholic recommendation of AA of which we have any knowledge. Since then, his labor for us has been a prodigy. Not only have his recommendations been heard worldwide, but he has himself worked at AA and for AA. Travels, AA meetings, wise and tender counsel. These works of his can be measured in thousands of miles and thousands of hours. In my entire acquaintance, our friend Father Ed is the only one from whom I have never heard a resentful word and of whom I have never heard a single criticism. In my own life he has been a friend, advisor, great example, and the source of more inspiration than I can say. Father Ed is made of the stuff of the saints. A great cheer of welcome greeted Father Ed Dowling as, indifferent to his grievous lameness, he made his way to the lectern. Father Dowling of the Jesuit order in St. Louis is intimately known to AAS for 1,000 miles and more around. Many in the convention audience remembered with gratitude his ministry to their spiritual needs. St. Louis old-timers recalled how he helped start their group. It had turned out to be largely Protestant, but this fazed him not a bit. Some of us could remember his first piece about us in the Queen's Work, the Sodalities magazine. He had been the first to note how closely in principle AA's 12 steps paralleled a part of the exercises of St. Ignatius, a basic spiritual discipline of the Jesuit order. He had boldly written in effect to all alcoholics and especially to those of his own faith, "Folks, AA is good. Come and get it." And this they certainly had done. His first written words were the beginning of a wonderfully benign influence in favor of our fellowship, the total of which no one will ever be able to compute. Father Ed's talk to us at the convention that Sunday morning flashed with humor and deep insight. As he spoke, the memory of his first appearance in my own life came back to me as fresh as though it were yesterday. One wintry night in 1940, in AA's old 24th Street Club in New York, I had gone to bed at about 10 o'clock with a severe dose of self-pity and my imaginary ulcer. Lois was out somewhere. Hail and sleet beat on the tin roof over my head. It was a wild night. The club was deserted except for old Tom, the retired fireman, that diamond in the rough lately salvaged from Rockland Asylum. The front doorbell clanged, and a moment later Tom pushed open my bedroom door. "Some bum," said he, "from St. Louis is down there and wants to see you." "Oh, Lord," I said. "Not another one? And at this time of night?" "Oh, well, bring him up." I heard labored steps on the stairs. Then, balanced precariously on his cane, he came into the room, carrying a battered black hat that was shapeless as a cabbage leaf and plastered with sleet. He lowered himself into my solitary chair, and when he opened his overcoat I saw his clerical collar. He brushed back a shock of white hair and looked at me through the most remarkable pair of eyes I have ever seen. We talked about a lot of things, and my spirits kept on rising, and presently I began to realize that this man radiated a grace that filled the room with a sense of presence. I felt this with great intensity. It was a moving and mysterious experience. In years since I have seen much of this great friend, and whether I was in joy or in pain he always brought to me the same sense of grace and the presence of God. My case is no exception. Many who meet Father Ed experience this touch of the eternal. It is no wonder that he was able to fill all of us therein. The Kiel Auditorium with his inimitable spirit on that wonderful Sunday morning. Everyone then present will remember this famous quote from Father Ed's St. Louis talk. There is a negative approach from agnosticism. This was the approach of Peter the Apostle. Lord, to whom shall we go? I doubt if there is anybody in this hall who really ever sought sobriety. I think we were trying to get away from drunkenness. I don't think we should despise the negative. I have a feeling that if I ever find myself in heaven, it will be from backing away from hell. In remembrance of Ebby, June 1966. In his 70th year, and on the 21st of March, my friend and sponsor Ebby passed beyond our sight and hearing. On a chill November afternoon in 1934, it was Ebby who had brought me the message that saved my life. Still more importantly, he was the bearer of the grace and of the principles that shortly afterward led to my spiritual awakening. This was truly a call to new life in the Spirit. It was the kind of rebirth that has since become the most precious possession of each and all of us. As I looked upon him where he lay in perfect repose, I was stirred by poignant memories of all the years I had known and loved him. There were recollections of those joyous days in a Vermont boarding school. After the war years we were sometimes together, then drinking, of course. Alcohol, we thought, was the solvent for all difficulties, a veritable elixir for good living. Then there was that absurd episode of 1929. Ebby and I were on an all-night spree in Albany. Suddenly we remembered that a new airfield had been constructed in Vermont, on a pasture near my own hometown. The opening day was close at hand. Then came the intoxicating thought, if only we could hire a plane we'd beat the opening by several days, thus making aviation history ourselves. Forthwith, Ebby rooted a pilot friend out of bed, and for a stiff price we engaged him and his small craft. We sent the town fathers a wire announcing the time of our arrival. In mid-morning, we took to the air, greatly elated and very tight. Somehow our rather tipsy pilot set us down on the field. A large crowd, including the village band and a welcoming committee, lustily cheered his feet. The pilot then deplaned. But nothing else happened, nothing at all. The onlookers stood in puzzled silence. Where were Ebby and Bill? Then the horrible discovery was made: we were both slumped in the rear cockpit of the plane, completely passed out. Kind friends lifted us down and stood us upon the ground. Whereupon we history makers fell flat on our faces. Ignominiously, we had to be carted away. The fiasco could not have been more appalling. We spent the next day shakily writing apologies. Over the following 5 years, I seldom saw Ebby. But of course our drinking went on and on. In late 1934 I got a terrific jolt when I learned that Ebby was about to be locked up, this time in a state mental hospital. Following a series of mad sprees, he had run his father's new Packard off the road and into the side of a dwelling, smashing right into its kitchen, and just missing a terrified housewife. Thinking to ease this rather awkward situation, Ebby summoned his brightest smile and said, "Well, my dear, how about a cup of coffee?" Of course, Ebby's light-hearted humor was quite lost on everyone concerned. Their patience worn thin, the town fathers yanked him into court. To all appearances, Ebby's final destination was the insane asylum. To me, this marked the end of the line for us both. Only a short time before, my physician, Dr. Silkworth, had felt obliged to tell Lois there was no hope of my recovery, that I, too, would have to be confined, else risk insanity or death. But Providence would have it otherwise. It was presently learned that Ebby had been paroled into the custody of friends who, for the time being, had achieved their sobriety in the Oxford groups. They brought Ebby to New York, where he fell under the benign influence of A's great friend-to-be, Dr. Sam Shoemaker, the rector of Calvary Episcopal Church. Much affected by Sam and the O.G., Ebby promptly sobered up. Hearing of my serious condition, he had straight away come to our house in Brooklyn. As I continued to recollect, the vision of Ebby looking at me across our kitchen table became wonderfully vivid. As most AAs know, he spoke to me of the release from hopelessness that had come to him, through the Oxford groups, as the result of self-survey, restitution, outgoing helpfulness to others, and prayer. In short, he was proposing the attitudes and principles that I used later in developing AA's 12 steps to recovery. It had happened. One alcoholic had effectively carried the message to another. Ebby had been enabled to bring me the gift of grace because he could reach me at depth through the language of the heart. He had pushed ajar that great gate through which all in AA have since passed to find their freedom under God. In memory of Harry, July 1966. By the time this issue of the Grapevine reaches its readers, the whole world of AA will have heard of the passing of our well-beloved friend, Dr. Harry M. Thibaut, the first psychiatrist ever to hold up the hands of our fellowship for all to see. His gifts of courageous example, deep perception of our needs, and constant labor in our behalf have been and always will be values quite beyond our reckoning. It began like this: the year was early 1939, and the book Alcoholics Anonymous was about to hit the press. To help with the final edit of that volume, we had made pre-publication copies in multigraph form. One of them fell into Harry's hands. Though much of the content was then alien to his own views, he read our upcoming book with deep interest. Far more significantly, he at once resolved to show the new volume to a couple of his patients, since known to us as Marty and Granny. These were the toughest kind of customers, and seemingly hopeless. At first, the book made little impression on this pair. Indeed, its heavy larding with the word God so angered Marty that she threw it out her window, flounced off the grounds of the swank sanitarium where she was, and proceeded to tie on a big bender. Granny didn't carry a rebellion quite so far, he played it cool. When Marty finally turned up, shaking badly, and asked Dr. Harry what next to do, he simply grinned and said, "You'd better read that book again." Back in her quarters, Marty finally brought herself to leaf through its pages once more. A single phrase caught her eye and it read, "We cannot live with resentment." The moment she admitted this to herself, she was filled with a transforming spiritual experience. Forthwith she attended a meeting. It was at Clinton Street, Brooklyn, where Lois and I lived. Returning to Blythewood, she found Granny intensely curious. Her first words to him were these: "Granny, we are not alone anymore." This was the beginning of recovery for both, recoveries that have lasted until this day. Watching their unfoldment, Harry was electrified. Only a week before they had both presented stone walls of obstinate resistance to his every approach. Now they talked, and freely. To Harry these were the facts, and brand new facts. Scientist and man of courage that he was, Harry did not for a moment look the other way. Setting aside his own convictions about alcoholism and its neurotic manifestations, he soon became convinced that AA had something, perhaps something big. All the years afterward, and often at very considerable risk to his professional standing, Harry continued to endorse AA. Considering Harry's professional standing, this required courage of the highest order. Let me share some concrete examples. In one of his early medical papers, that noted one on surrender, he had declared this ego-reducing practice to be not only basic to AA, but also absolutely fundamental to his own practice of psychiatry. This took humility as well as fortitude. It will always be a bright example for us all. Nevertheless, this much was but a bare beginning. In 1944, helped by Dr. Kirby Collier of Rochester and Dwight Anderson of New York, Harry had persuaded the American Medical Society of the State of New York to let me, a layman, read a paper about AA at their annual gathering. 5 years later, this same trio, again spearheaded by Harry, persuaded the American Psychiatric Association to invite the reading of another paper by me, this time in their 1949 annual meeting at Montreal. By then, AA had about 100,000 members, and many psychiatrists had already seen at close range our impact on their patients. For us of AA who were present at that gathering, it was a breathtaking hour. My presentation would be the spiritual experience, as we AAS understood it. Surely we could never get away with this. To our astonishment, the paper was extremely well received, judging, at least, from the sustained applause. Immediately afterward, I was approached by a most distinguished old gentleman. He introduced himself as an early president of the American Psychiatric Association. Beaming, he said, "Mr. W., it is very possible that I am the only one of my colleagues here today who really believes in spiritual experience as you do. Once upon a time, I myself had an awakening much akin to your own, an experience that I shared in common with two close friends, Buck and Whitman." Naturally I inquired, "But why did your colleagues seem to like the paper?" His reply went like this: "You see, we psychiatrists deeply know what very difficult people you alcoholics really are. It was not the claims of your paper that stirred my friends, it was the fact that AA can sober up alcoholics wholesale." Seen in this light, I was the more deeply moved by the generous and magnificent tribute that had been paid to us of AA. My paper was soon published in the American Psychiatric Journal, and our New York headquarters was authorized by the association to make all the reprints we wished for distribution. By then the trek of AA overseas had well begun. Heaven only knows what this invaluable reprint accomplished when it was presented to psychiatrists in distant places by the fledgling AA groups. It vastly hastened the worldwide acceptance of AA. I could go on and on about Harry, telling you of his activities in the general field of alcoholism, of his signal service on our AA Board of Trustees. I could tell stories of my own delightful friendship with him, especially remembering his great good humor and infectious laugh. But the space allotted me is too limited. For Sister Ignatia, August 1966. Sister Mary Ignatia, one of the finest friends that we of AA shall ever know, went to her reward Friday morning, April 2, 1966. Next day, the Sisters of Charity of St. Augustine opened their mother house to visitors. More than 1,000 of them signed the guest book in the first 2 hours. These were the first of many who during the 2 days following came to pay their respects to Sister. On Monday at high noon, the cathedral at Cleveland could barely seat its congregation. Friends in the city and from afar attended the service. The Sisters of Charity themselves were seen to be seated in a body, radiant in their faith. Together with families and friends, we of AA had come there in expression of our gratitude for the life and works of our well-loved sister. It was not really a time for mourning, it was instead a time to thank God for His great goodness to us all. In its affirmation of the faith, the Mass was of singular beauty, the more so to many, since it was spoken in English. The eulogy, written and read by a close friend of Sister's, was a graphic and stirring portrayal of her character and of her deeds. There was a most special emphasis upon the merits of AA, and upon the part co-founder Dr. Bob had played in Sister's great adventure among us. We were assured as seldom before that those who dwell in the fellowship of the Spirit need never be concerned with barriers or with boundaries. For those thousands of men, women, and children whose lives had been directly touched and illumined by Sister, it would perhaps not be needful to write this account of her. Of Sister, and of the grace she brought to all these, they already know better than anyone else. But to the many others who have never felt her presence and her love, it is hoped this narrative may be something for their special inspiration. Born in 1889 of devout and liberty-loving parents, Sister entered into this world at Shenville, County Mayo, of the Emerald Isle. The famed poet Yeats, born nearby, once remarked that the strange beauty of County Mayo had been specially designed to raise up poets, artists, heroes, and saints. We can little doubt that even when Ignatia was aged 6, and her parents had emigrated from Ireland to Cleveland, she was already beginning to manifest many a sterling virtue. Soon the child began to reveal unusual musical talents, both for piano and voice. A few years later she was seen giving lessons at the home of her parents. During 1914, she became possessed of a great desire to become a religious. In this year she joined the community that many of us AAS know so well, the Sisters of Charity of St. Augustine. There she continued her musical education and her teaching. But even then, as ever since, Sister was frail, exceeding frail. By 1933 the rigors of her music teaching had become too great. She had a really serious physical breakdown. Her doctor put to her this choice: you will have to take it easy. You can either be a dead music teacher or a live sister. Which is it going to be? With great good cheer, so her community says, Mary Ignatia accepted a much quieter and less distinguished assignment. She became the registrar at St. Thomas Hospital in Akron, Ohio, an institution administered by her order. At the time it was wondered if she could manage even this much. That she would live to the age of 77 was not believable. That she was destined to minister to 15,000 alcoholics and their families in the years to come was known only to God. For a considerable time Sister serenely carried on at the admissions desk in St. Thomas. It was not then certain she had ever heard of AA. Though Group 1 at Akron and Group 2 in New York had been in slow and fitful growth since 1935, neither had come to public notice. However, in 1939, the scene changed abruptly. In the spring of that year the AA book was first printed, and Liberty magazine came up with an article about our society in the early fall. This was quickly followed by a whole series of remarkable pieces which were carried by the Cleveland Plain Dealer on its editorial page. The newspaper and the mere 24 AAS then in town were swamped by frantic pleas for help. Despite this rather chaotic situation, the Cleveland membership burgeoned into several hundreds in a few months. Nevertheless, the implications of this AA population explosion were in some ways disturbing, especially the lack of proper hospital facilities. Though the Cleveland hospitals had rallied gallantly to this one emergency, their interest naturally waned when bills often went unpaid, and when ex-drunks trooped through the corridors to do what they called 12th step work on sometimes noisy victims just arrived. Even the city hospital at Akron, where Dr. Bob had attended numerous cases, was showing signs of weariness. In New York we had temporarily got off to a better start. There we had dear old Dr. Silkworth and, after a while, his wonderful AA nurse Teddy. This pair were to process some 12,000 New York area drunks in the years ahead, and so they became, as it were, the opposite numbers to the partnership of co-founder Dr. Bob and Sister Ignatia at Akron. Much concerned that, hospital-wise, his area might be caught quite unprepared to cope with a great new flood of publicity about AA, Dr. Bob in 1940 decided to visit St. Thomas and explain the great need for a hospital connection that could prove permanently effective. Since St. Thomas was a church institution, he thought the people there might vision a fine opportunity for service where the others had not. And how right he was. But Bob knew no one in authority at the hospital. So he simply betook himself to admissions and told the diminutive nun in charge the story of AA, including that of his own recovery. As this tale unfolded, the little sister glowed. Her compassion was deeply touched, and perhaps her amazing intuition had already begun to say, "This is it." Of course Sister would try to help, but what could one small nun do? After all, there were certain attitudes and regulations. Alcoholism had not been reckoned as an illness, it was just a dire form of gluttony. Dr. Bob then told Sister about an alcoholic who then was in a most serious condition. A bed would simply have to be found for him. Said Mary Ignatia, "I'm sure your friend must be very sick." "You know, doctor, this sounds to me like a terrible case of indigestion." Trying to keep a straight face, Dr. Bob replied, "How right you are, his indigestion is most terrible." Twinkling, Sister immediately said, "Why don't you bring him in right away?" The two benign conspirators were soon faced with yet another dilemma. The victim proved to be distressingly intoxicated. It would soon be clear to all and sundry that his indigestion was quite incidental. Obviously a ward wouldn't do. There would have to be a private room. But all the single ones were filled. What on earth could they do? Sister pursed her lips and then broke into a broad smile. Forthwith she declared, "I'll have a bed moved into our flower room. In there he can't disturb anyone." This was hurriedly done, and the indigestion sufferer was already on his way to sobriety and health. Of course the conspirators were conscience-stricken by their subterfuge of the flower room. And anyhow, the indigestion pretense simply couldn't last. Somebody in authority would have to be told, and that somebody was the hospital superior. With great trepidation, Sister and Dr. Bob waited upon this good lady, and explained themselves. To their immense delight she went along, and a little later she boldly unfolded the new project before the St. Thomas trustees. To their everlasting credit they went along too, so much so that it was not a great while before Dr. Bob himself was invited to become a staff physician at St. Thomas, a bright example indeed of the ecumenical spirit. Presently a whole ward was devoted to the rehabilitation of alcoholics, and Sister Ignatia was of course placed in immediate charge. Dr. Bob sponsored the new cases into the hospital and medically treated each, never sending a bill to any. The hospital fees were very moderate and Sister often insisted on taking in patients on a pay-later basis, sometimes to the mild consternation of the trustees. Together Ignatia and Dr. Bob indoctrinated all who cared to listen to the AA approach as portrayed by the book Alcoholics Anonymous, lately come off the press. The ward was open to visiting AAs from surrounding groups who, morning to night, told their stories of drinking and of recovery. There were never any barriers of race or creed, neither was AA nor church teaching pressed upon anyone. Since nearly all her strenuous hours were spent there, Sister became a central figure on the ward. She would alternately listen and talk, with infinite tenderness and understanding. The alcoholic's family and friends received the very same treatment. It was this most compassionate caring that was a chief ingredient of her unique grace. It magnetically drew everyone to her, even the most rough and obstinate. Yet she would not always stand still for errant nonsense. When the occasion required, she could really put her foot down. Then to ease the hurt, she would turn on her delightful humor. Once, when a recalcitrant drunk boasted he'd never again be seen at the hospital, Sister shot back, "Well, let's hope not. But just in case you do show up, please remember that we already have your size of pajamas. They will be ready and waiting for you." As the fame of St. Thomas grew, alcoholics flocked in from distant places. After their hospitalization they often remained for a time in Akron to get more first-hand AA from Dr. Bob, and from Akron's group number 1. On their return home, Sister would carry on an ever-mounting correspondence with them. We AAs are often heard to say that our fellowship is founded upon resources that we have drawn from medicine, from religion, and from our own experience of drinking and of recovery. Never before nor since those Akron early days have we witnessed a more perfect synthesis of all these healing forces. Dr. Bob exemplified both medicine and AA, Ignatia and the Sisters of St. Augustine also practiced applied medicine, and their practice was supremely well animated by the wonderful spirit of their community. A more perfect blending of grace and talent cannot be imagined. It should never be necessary to dwell, one by one, upon the virtues of these magnificent friends of AA's early time, Sister Ignatia and co-founder Dr. Bob. We need only recollect that by their fruits we shall always know them. Standing before the Cleveland International Convention of 1950, Dr. Bob looked upon us of AA for the last time. His good wife Anne had passed on before, and his own rendezvous with the new life to come was not many months away. 10 years had slipped by since the day when he and Sister had bedded down that first sufferer in the St. Thomas flower room. In this marvelous decade, Sister and Dr. Bob had medically treated, and had spiritually infused, 5,000 alcoholics. The greater part of these had found their freedom under God. In thankful recollection of this great work, we have presented to the Sisters of Charity of St. Augustine and to the staff of the St. Thomas Hospital a bronze plaque, ever since to be seen in the ward where Sister and Dr. Bob had wrought their wonders. The plaque reads as follows. In gratitude, the friends of Dr. Bob and NS affectionately dedicate this memorial to the Sisters and staff of St. Thomas Hospital. At Akron, birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous, St. Thomas Hospital became the first religious institution ever to open its door to our society. May the loving devotion of those who labored here in our pioneering time be a bright and wondrous example of God's grace everlastingly set before us all. Visitors at St. Thomas today often wonder why this inscription says not a word about Sister Ignatia. Well, the fact was, she wouldn't allow her name to be used. She had flatly refused. It was one of those times when she had put her foot down. This was of course a glowing example of her innate and absolutely genuine humility. Sister truly believed that she deserved no particular notice, that such grace as she might have could only be credited to God and to the community of her sisters. This was indeed the ultimate spirit of anonymity. We who had then seen this quality in her were deeply affected, especially Dr. Bob and myself. Hers came to be the influence that persuaded us both never to accept public honors of any sort. Sister's example taught that a mere observance of the form of anonymity should never become the slightest excuse for ignoring its spiritual substance. Following Dr. Bob's death, there was great concern lest Sister might not be allowed to continue her work. As in other orders of the Church, service assignments among the Sisters of Charity were rather frequently rotated. This was the ancient custom. However, nothing happened for a time. Assisted by surrounding AA groups, Sister continued to carry on at St. Thomas. Then suddenly in 1952, she was transferred to St. Vincent Charity Hospital at Cleveland, where, to the delight of us all, she was placed in charge of its alcoholic ward. At Akron a fine successor was named to succeed her. The work there would continue. The ward at Charity occupied part of a dilapidated wing, and it was in great need of repair and rejuvenation. To those who knew and loved Sister, this opportunity proved a most stimulating challenge. The Charity trustees also agreed that something should be done. Substantial contributions flowed in. In their spare hours, AA carpenters, plumbers, and electricians set about redoing the old wing no charge for their services. The beautiful result of these labors of love is now known as Rosary Hall. Again the miracles of recovery from alcoholism commenced to multiply. During the following 14 years, an astonishing 10,000 alcoholics passed through the portals of Rosary Hall, there to fall under the spell of Mary Ignatia and of AA. More than 2/3 of all these recovered from their dire malady, and again became citizens of the world. From dawn to dark Sister offered her unique grace to that endless procession of stricken sufferers. Moreover, she still found time to minister widely to their families, and this very fruitful part of her work became a prime inspiration to the Al-Anon family groups of the whole region. Notwithstanding her wonderful workers within the hospital, and help from AAS without, this must have been a most exacting and exhausting vocation for the increasingly frail Sister. That she was providentially enabled to be with us for so many years is something for our great wonder. To hundreds of friends it became worth a day's journey to witness her supreme and constant demonstration. Toward the close of her long stewardship there were brushes with death. Sometimes I came to Cleveland and was allowed to sit by her bedside. Then I saw her at her best. Her perfect faith and her complete acceptance of whatever God might will were somehow implicit in all she said, be our conversation gay or serious. Fear and uncertainty seemed entire strangers to her. On my leave-taking, there was always that smiling radiance, always her prayerful hope that God might still allow her a bit more time at Rosary Hall. Then a few days later I would learn that she was back at her desk. This superb drama would be reenacted time after time. She was quite unconscious that there was anything at all unusual about it. Realizing there would come the day which would be her last, it seemed right that we of AA should privately present Sister with some tangible token that could, even a little, communicate to her the depth of our love. Remembering her insistence, in respect of the Akron plaque, that she would not really like any public attention, I simply sent word that I'd like to come to Cleveland for a visit, and casually added that should her health permit, we might take supper together in the company of a few of her stalwart AA friends and co-workers. Besides, it was her 50th year of service in her community. On the appointed evening, we foregathered in one of the small dining rooms at Charity Hospital. Plainly delighted, Sister arrived. She was barely able to walk. Since we were old-timers all, the dinner hour was spent in telling tales of other days. For her part, Sister regaled us with stories of St. Thomas and with cherished recollections of N and co-founder Dr. Bob. It was unforgettable. Before Sister became too tired, we addressed ourselves to our main project. From New York, I had brought an illuminated scroll. Its wording was in the form of a letter addressed by me to Sister, and it was written on behalf of our AA fellowship worldwide. I stood up, read the scroll aloud, and then held the parchment for her to see. She was taken by complete surprise and could scarcely speak for a time. In a low voice she finally said, "Oh, but this is too much, this is too good for me." Our richest reward of the evening was of course Ignatia's delight, a joy unbounded the moment we assured her that our gift need not be publicized. That if she wished to stow it away in her trunk we would quite understand. It then seemed that this most memorable and moving evening was over. But there was to be another inspiring experience. Making light of her great fatigue, Sister insisted that we all go up to Rosary Hall, there to make a late round of the AA ward. This we did, wondering if any of us would ever again see her at work in the divine vocation to which she had given her all. For each of us this was the end of an epoch. I could think only of her poignant and oft-repeated saying, "Eternity is now." The scroll given to Sister may now be seen at Rosary Hall. This is the inscription. In gratitude for Sister Mary Ignatia on the occasion of her Golden Jubilee. Dear Sister, we of Alcoholics Anonymous look upon you as the finest friend and the greatest spirit we may ever know. We remember your tender ministrations to us in the days when AA was very young. Your partnership with Dr. Bob in that early time has created for us a spiritual heritage of incomparable worth. In all the years since, we have watched you at the bedside of thousands. So watching, we have perceived ourselves to be the beneficiaries of that wondrous light which God has always sent through you to illumine our darkness. You have tirelessly tended our wounds, you have nourished us with your unique understanding and your matchless love. No greater gifts of grace than these shall we ever have. Speaking for AA members throughout the world, I say, may God abundantly reward you according to your blessed works now and forever. In devotion. Bill W. Samuel Shoemaker, February 1967. Dr. Sam Shoemaker was one of AA's indispensables. Had it not been for his ministry to us in our early time, our fellowship would not be in existence today. Therefore the recent publication of his biography entitled I Stand by the Door, so well authored by his wife Helen, is a poignant reminder of our great debt and a welcome addition to our comprehension of this magnificent friend. First let me acquaint our newer generations with the Sam we oldsters knew so well in the first days of AA, and in the years since. For this purpose I'd like to tell of Sam's appearance at our International Convention in 1955, held in St. Louis. I quote as follows from our book of history, AA Comes of Age. Dr. Sam looked scarcely a day older than he had almost 21 years earlier when I first met him and his dynamic group at Calvary's Parish House in New York. As he began to speak, his impact fell upon us there in the Kiel auditorium just as it had upon Lois and me years before. As always, he called a spade, and his blazing eagerness, earnestness, and crystal clarity drove home his message point by point. With all his vigor and power of speech, Sam nevertheless kept himself right down to size. Here was a man quite as willing to talk about his sins as about anybody else's. He made himself a witness of God's power and love just as any AA might have done. Sam's appearance before us was further evidence that many a channel had been used by Providence to create Alcoholics Anonymous. And none had been more vitally needed than the one opened through Sam Shoemaker and his Oxford group, associates of a generation before. The early AA got its ideas of self-examination, acknowledgement of character defects, restitution for harm done, and working with others straight from the Oxford group and directly from Sam Shoemaker, their one-time leader in America, and from nowhere else. He will always be found in our annals as the one whose inspired example and teaching did the most to show us how to create the spiritual climate in which we alcoholics may survive and then proceed to grow. AA owes a debt of timeless gratitude for all that God sent to us through Sam and his friends in the early days of AA's infancy. No one, I think, can read Helen Shoemaker's book, I Stand by the Door, without being the better for it. This vivid and moving account of Sam at home, in his ministry, and in his public life is a portrait in breadth and in depth of one of the finest human beings of our time. Bernard B. Smith, October 1970. I deeply regret that my health will not permit me to attend the services for my old friend Bern Smith. His death is a great personal loss to me, for I have leaned heavily upon him for many years. His wise counsel was always mine for the asking, the warmth of his friendship, mine from the beginning. From the very beginning, Bern Smith understood the spiritual basis upon which the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous rests. Such an understanding is rare among outsiders. But Bern never was an outsider, not really. He not only understood our fellowship, he believed in it as well. Just 1 month ago today, Bern made a remarkable and inspiring talk to some 11,000 of our members gathered in Miami Beach to celebrate our fellowship's 35th anniversary. The subject of his talk was unity, truly an apt subject, for no man did more than he to assure unity within our fellowship. For that matter, he did much to assure our very survival, for he was one of the principal architects of our General Service Conference. Bern Smith would not want, nor does he need, encomiums from me. What he has done for Alcoholics Anonymous speaks far louder than any words of mine could ever do. His wisdom and vision will be sorely missed by us all. I can only add that I have lost an old and valued friend, a great and devoted servant. Articles about Grapevine. Editorial, The Shape of Things to Come, June 1944. In the book Alcoholics Anonymous there is a chapter called The Vision for You. Wandering through it recently, my eye was caught by this startling paragraph written a short 5 years ago. Someday we hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find a fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. To some extent this is already true. Some of us are salesmen and go about. Little clusters of 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities through contact with our 2 large centers. Rubbing my eyes I looked again. A lump came into my throat. Only 5 years, I thought. Then but 2 large centers, little clusters of 2s and 3s, travelers who hoped one day to find us at every destination. Could it be only yesterday that this was just a hope, those little clusters of 2s and 3s, those little beacons so anxiously watched as they flickered, but never went out? And today, there are hundreds of centers shedding their warm illumination upon the lives of thousands, lighting the dark shoals where the stranded and hopeless lie, breaking up those fingers of light already stretching to our beachheads in other lands. Now comes another lighted lamp, this little newspaper called Grapevine. May its rays of hope and experience ever fall upon the current of our life and one day illumine every dark corner of this alcoholic world. The aspirations of its editors, contributors, and readers could well be voiced in the last words of A Vision for You, abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find, and join us. We shall be with you, in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. May God bless you and keep you until then. Grapevine, past, present, and future. July 1945. Grapevine has just completed the first year of its existence. Scores of enthusiastic letters are coming in. They are written from all parts of the United States and some from foreign countries. They congratulate Grapevine staff and ask them to keep up their good work. To these felicitations I'd like to add my own. A grand job has been done by the volunteer staff, who gave freely a vast amount of time and labor. And some gave money, too. You don't start a paper on hay. To the retiring volunteers, I want to say, along with every Grapevine subscriber, congratulations and thanks. How did Grapevine start, and where does it go from here? Last summer several New York AAs decided it was about time the groups in our metropolitan area had a monthly publication. At first there was some discussion about getting it suitably endorsed by the local groups, the Alcoholic Foundation or somebody. But no one could endorse a magazine that hadn't yet appeared. Grapeviners went ahead anyway on the theory that if their sheet was good enough it would take on, if it proved too corny or dull it would flop automatically and quickly. People could, Grapeviners said, take it or leave it alone. In a burst of local pride the Grapevine staff mailed the first printing to all the groups in the United States. No pressure or soliciting. They just mailed it. Subscriptions began to filter in from everywhere. No longer a trickle, they are today a stream. Grapevine now has subscribers in every one of the 48 states and even abroad. Foreseeing a broader activity, members of the Grapevine staff were good enough to ask me a few months ago if I would take an interest in the venture for the coming year. They told me they thought the magazine might be enlarged to national dimensions, that ultimately it should be incorporated, and finally, perhaps, hooked up with the Alcoholic Foundation, which, as nearly every AA knows, is the sponsor of our central office and all our national undertakings. This conversation made it abundantly plain that while rotating squads of volunteers might always continue to procure and edit pieces for Grapevine and participate in setting its policy, there could be no doubt that continuous paid help and enlarged working facilities would soon be necessary. They asked if I would help with these arrangements and perhaps contribute a piece occasionally. These things, health permitting, I agreed to do. Besides the volunteer staff, we now boast one part-time paid secretarial worker to help handle details. This work, however, continues to mount, as does the volume of potential editorial content. More paid help will probably become necessary and the size of the magazine may have to be expanded, all of which would require a slight increase in the subscription rate. Grapevine is self-supporting now and should be kept that way always, rather than be dependent on subsidies or gratuities, to ensure its continuity, quality, and service. Though Grapevine is young, it is commencing to have its own tradition. Every member of the staff aspires to make the paper a true voice of AA. All of us are very sensitive to the thought that it ought never to be sectional in its appeal nor should it take sides on any controversial question. While it must constantly talk of people, in its news and views, it ought never to glorify or belittle anyone, nor lend itself to a commercial undertaking, nor become a mere mouthpiece for any of us, even the Central Office or the Alcoholic Foundation. Of course, everybody will see pieces in Grapevine now and then with which he or she will not agree. So it must always be understood that these pieces reflect the thoughts and feelings of their authors but not necessarily those of the Grapevine. To crystallize these traditions and principles we ask for more contributions from all parts of the country. Meanwhile, please don't expect too much of us too quickly. We are still understaffed, we can't possibly answer all of your letters and inquiries. I am afraid that will have to go for me, too. I shall be unable to engage in personal correspondence. I can only write a piece to all of you now and then. If agreeable to the subscribers, I would like to discuss in coming issues such topics as anonymity, leadership, public relations, the use of money in AA, and the like. Upon matters such as these, our tradition and practice is by no means well settled. Like most older AAS, I have come to place great reliance on the ability of our groups to work out correct principles, once given sufficient experience. The purpose, therefore, of the forthcoming pieces will be to present the current thought, the pros and cons, on these moot questions. These articles will be suggestive only. Their object will be to promote further discussion rather than to announce any new principle. We of Grapevine once more affirm that this is your periodical. It will be the vehicle for your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences, and your aspirations if you care to make it that. While we can only publish a fraction of the material which will come to hand, you may be sure that we shall do our fairest and best in making the selections. Always wishing to reflect AA and nothing but AA, it will be the ideal of Grapevine always to serve, never to dictate or command. Please help us make it a true voice. What is our AA Grapevine? December 1946. Hundreds of AAS have not yet seen or heard of Grapevine. Others query, who is it? What is it? What are its ideals? So I have been asked to explain. Grapevine is our principal monthly journal. It is devoted to the interests of Alcoholics Anonymous and to nothing else. It tries to publish the news and portray the views of AAS everywhere. It aims to reflect a cross-section of our thought and action. Already reaching all parts of America, it is beginning to be read in foreign lands. Some of its 5,600 subscribers are non-alcoholics vitally interested in our progress and philosophy. In short, Grapevine is rapidly becoming the collective voice of Alcoholics Anonymous. Like everything else that is good, Grapevine has been an evolution, not a promotion. Like Topsy, it just grew. Now let me cut back into our past to let you see more of why and how Grapevine came to be. 10 years ago our fellowship was a weak and wobbly infant, just a few alcoholics clinging desperately to an ideal and to each other. These early ones were the originators of the Alcoholics Anonymous movement. As our numbers swelled, the newer members naturally looked to the older ones for help and example. They began to call us older ones leaders, and in the case of Dr. Bob and myself, they coined for each of us the rather resounding title of founder. Since AA really had a score of founders, he and I really wish that hadn't occurred. But it did, simply, we suppose, because we were the first in point of time and were therefore of the longest experience. Thus it happened that we came to have, in the minds of our fellow AAS, a rather unique status. Never official, always informal, yet there it was. In matters of principle or policy, AAS began to regard Bob and me as representing their collective conscience. They also began to think of us as a sort of heart to the movement, which took in the constant stream of incoming problems and perplexities and then pumped out answers. Then, as we went about among the growing groups, he and I were asked to stand on platforms and expound AA to ever larger audiences. So it was that we became the collective voice of AA. As a friend put it, that was a whale of a big order. Bob and I agree with him. It's too big an assignment for any two alcoholics. We're too fallible. And were we infallible, we couldn't last forever anyhow. Hence he and I have been, for a long time now, in process of passing these functions of conscience, heart, and voice over to others. Years ago we helped set up the Alcoholic Foundation, whose trustees became guardians of your general AA funds, and who of late, by custom and general consent, are more and more regarded as the custodians of AA tradition and general policy. The trustees are no body of authority. They simply act as a sort of general service committee to all AA. Primarily they are custodians and mediators. As such, they are beginning to be seen by the groups as representing our collective AA conscience. Bob and I hope that trend will continue. This seems likely as the trustees and their duties are becoming better understood. A year after the creation of the Alcoholic Foundation, the book Alcoholics Anonymous was published in April 1939. This too was the enterprise of a group of AA members who thought our experience ought to be codified and set on paper. This group supplied funds, suggestions, and stories. Bob and I were given the task of deciding what should go into the book, and I was assigned the writing of its text. The publication of the AA book marked the point in our history where our early members, along with Bob and myself, transferred our experience through this new medium to an ever wider circle which now promises to be the wide world of alcoholism. The AA Central Office at New York came into being simultaneously with the book. Here our staff nowadays answers thousands of inquiries, looks after our overall public relations, writes letters of encouragement to new and isolated groups, sees to the printing and distribution of group lists, pamphlets, literature, and the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Several years ago the trustees of our foundation acquired full ownership of the AA book and at the same time assumed a custodial oversight of the central office, whose financial support has gradually been taken over by the groups through their voluntary contributions to the foundation. Thousands of new members have found their way to AA, hundreds of groups have been helped with their growing pains, and millions of people have heard of AA through the functioning of the central office. Little by little, our central office is becoming recognized as the heart of AA. It receives inquiries and problems, then pumps out information and the best answers it can. Thus one more function of the originators of AA is in process of transfer to the central office staff. The central office has almost become the central heart of AA. Now, you say, what has all this got to do with the Grapevine? Just this: like the earlier groups which assembled the foundation, the AA book, and the central office, the Grapevine began 2 years ago among several newspaper-minded AAs who thought we needed a monthly periodical. They were willing to contribute a little money and boundless effort to make it a success. At the beginning, this group of AAs had no special authorization from anyone. They merely took off their coats and did a job so well done that at the end of a year they found their paper in national distribution. There was no sponsoring, no promoting. Like the AA book, the central office, and the foundation, the Grapevine became a national institution on its own effort and merit. Arrived at this point, members of the staff came to the trustees to discuss the future of the publication. They also asked me to write some pieces and requested me to ascertain if the groups would like to have this periodical as their principal AA publication. Hundreds of groups and individual subscribers came back with an enthusiastic yes. There was scarce a single dissent. Accordingly, the Grapevine was incorporated, its beneficial ownership transferred to the foundation, and it is now being managed by a joint committee composed of 2 trustees of the foundation, 2 members of the volunteer staff, and its editor. Not quite self-supporting yet, we hope it will presently become so. Consequently we are witnessing still another transference. The Grapevine is becoming the voice of Alcoholics Anonymous. As one of the staff members recently put it, we think that Grapevine ought to become the voice of Alcoholics Anonymous, bringing us news of each other across great distances, and always describing what can be freshly seen in that vast and life-giving pool we call AA experience. Never taking part in the controversial issues of religion, reform, or politics, never seeking profit, never lending itself to commerce or propaganda, always mindful of our sole aim to carry the AA message to those who suffer alcoholism. Such is our idea for Grapevine. With these sentiments Dr. Bob and I heartily concur. We hope that AAs everywhere will feel it to be their newspaper, that our able AA writers will contribute freely, that all groups will send in news of their doings which may be of general interest, that Grapevine will presently take its place in the minds of all AAs as one of our essential central services close alongside the Foundation, the AA book, and the central office. You see, dear fellow members, Dr. Bob and I have a slightly ulterior motive. For, when the transfer of our original functions of conscience, heart, and voice is made complete to these newer, better, and more permanent agencies, then we old-timers can really take a walk. Through the A Looking Glass, November 1950. This is a plug for Grapeviners and all their works. May they live long and prosper. One looks in one's mirror to powder, shave, or admire. But the good AA is apt to look deeper. Every morning he gives thanks for a sober countenance, he asks forgiveness for lingering resentment, he hopes for grace to live the coming day well. At nightfall he takes another look, saying, "Well, my friend, how did we do today? Thanks be to thee for the privilege of living." Thus the A's mirror reflects not rouge, but gratitude, not conceit, but humility, not froth, but reality. It reflects a priceless experience. Reading Grapevine is something kindred. But Grapevine is a far bigger mirror. Here we get an inspiring glance over the other fellow's shoulder as he meditates. We're magically transported into the midst of our brothers and sisters everywhere. We feel at one with them. Alice in Wonderland was never like that. Through the A Looking Glass we joyously roam the spacious mansion which Providence has provided us, that incredible freedom house called A. For Grapevine is truly your magazine and mine. Its contents, month by month, are your thoughts, your ideas about AA and anything else that may be on your mind. Each month more than 200 of you, on an average, send in something to be printed. Grapevine is not written by a bunch of high-domed ivory tower boys in New York. You write it? With each issue, you see how ably the cream of your editorial contributions has been selected and how skillfully presented in a publication which each one of us can be proud of. Perhaps you've wondered how this job is done so well each 30 days. Well, it's done as most everything else in AA is done by AA members who pitch in and do it with no thought of reward other than to help. Unpaid, unsung, perhaps they've labored long enough in complete anonymity, even among their own fellows. So, maybe, you'd like to meet Grapeviners. They're the ones who capture those precious images for you. Each month they give you the freshest sights, sounds, and impressions of AA on the march. Grapevine is the magic carpet on which you can ride our circuit. First off, here's Al, the editor. Al is supposed to be a hard-working feature writer for the newsreels. When he actually works for the pictures, nobody can say. Most of the time he's at the Grapevine office putting the paper to bed or, maybe, getting it up in the morning. Whatever editors are supposed to do, Al really does. Read the Grapevine and you'll agree. Now meet Clyde, Paul, Rod, and Sig. The first is a noted fiction editor, the second is a top rewrite man, the third is one of those advertising execs, and the fourth, well, he's somehow in public relations. All this brass probably checks Al up and surely backs him up. Now and then they dash off pieces themselves. Next come the art boys, Bud and Glenn. Pretty keen, too. But they should be. They're top-hole art directors and illustrators on the outside. Have you seen the Grapevine artwork lately? Better take a look. Or better still, subscribe. At this point I present Grapevine money experts. The fact it is running a deficit isn't their fault at all. In real life both of them, Mike and, another, Bud, are treasurers for publishing houses. Mike is also the Grapevine treasurer. He took over that bleak and thankless job from Dick S. Not the Cleveland Dick S., a while back. Bud lingers on as a contributor and elder statesman, for he is, you must know, one of the founders of our journal. To be dead sure everything is buttoned down tight, the Grapevine has two more money men, super money men. They're the foundation trustees, Jonas and Leonard, who sit in with Grapevine management. The Grapevine and You and Me, June 1957. A Grapevine has some plans which I would like to discuss with you, and these plans include frequent articles by me. I shall try to write something to all of you each month during the next year. Several considerations have prompted this resolve. The first is that Lois and I can no longer travel about to see you, face to face. We admit we are nor quite so young as we used to be. If we go much of anywhere, then in fairness we ought to go everywhere. But everywhere in AA is now a lot of territory. It takes in North America, 70 overseas beachheads, and 200,000 AAS. If we journeyed out to see all of you, I guess we'd never get home. So this is a very good reason why I want to chat with you every month in the Grapevine. It can be the next best substitute for widespread travel. Another reason is this. As AA grows in breadth and depth, so should Grapevine, for this is the largest mirror we have of up-to-date AA thought, feeling, and activity. Thanks to its devoted workers and contributors of the past, our magazine has always managed to grow. Periodically Grapevine makes a special effort in this direction. One of these spurts is on right now. We want to catch up with worldwide AA in all of its new and fascinating facets and ramifications. We want to catch up with the old-timer who sometimes thinks, perhaps rightly, that our magazine is too much slanted to the problems of the newcomer. So then, what can you and I do about it? First, we have to clear away a serious handicap. If a bigger and better journal is to be produced, its staff, paid and volunteer, will have to be enlarged, the paid people a little, the volunteers a lot. Both in subscription and editorial departments the magazine has long been understaffed. The fact is that Grapeviners have been waging a losing battle against inflation, a battle which has been going on a long time. At 25 cents, the price has stood unchanged for the last dozen or so years. It's about the only remaining article in the world that hasn't gone up, except perhaps Lifesavers candies. Meantime, the costs of putting out the periodical have soared, just like everything else. Even after the recent big push for subscriptions, the Grapevine still can't get by. This state of affairs is totally unsafe for the long run, and it is a bar to any large improvement in size or quality, now or ever, under these conditions. This spells it out that the price surely has to go up to 35 cents a copy or $3.50 a year. Of course, we know that everybody will be glad to give that extra dime for the Grapevine. A preliminary survey abundantly confirms that fact. This will take away the hurdle that our Grapeviners, for all of their dedication, can no longer surmount. With this accomplished, you and I can still help a lot. Grapevine wants to add 16 more pages. It wants to add several departments, a new section, Al-Anon activities, and others. It wants more interest for our 5 and 10-year members. It is looking hard for every promising new idea the staff can lay hands on. Surely you and I could supply some of these much-needed ideas. So why don't you folks out there sit down and write me some idea letters? I don't mean pieces or full articles quite yet. What Grapevine wants is your notion of what you would like to see printed in the magazine. This could include a vision of new departments, a topical list of new subject matter, or actual titles for new articles on which the staff could follow through, and what most especially you would like me to write about in the coming 12 months. On your part this will have to be very much a labor of love, quite in the spirit of anonymity. I'm sure your mail will be far too large for me to answer. But you certainly can, and I know you will, give the Grapeviners and me a wonderful lot of excellent and usable ammunition. Consider, readers, what a bargain you are getting. If we bought all this brass, at the full-time rates they soak folks on the outside, we'd be paying them about $10,000 a month. But for us AAS they sit up entire nights working on Grapevine for nothing but love. Can you beat that? Let's not get the wrong idea. Let's have no illusion that it doesn't cost money to produce Grapevine. When a magazine has a circulation of 23,000, there are problems that didn't exist when its readers could be counted in the hundreds. Even perspiring volunteers can't steal enough time from their breadwinning activities to do what needs to be done. Offices are needed. Files, and plenty of filing space is called for. Records must be kept so that your subscription doesn't get lost. Expensive equipment must be bought. Correspondence must be answered. Phones must be answered. So Grapevine must have full-time workers, a paid staff, of non-alcoholics, who do 90% of the job. The editor claims that these hard-working non-alkies do all the drudgery and then he and the drunks move in and take all the bows. So let's not patronize or underestimate these full-timers. Let's meet them. First, there's our conscientious Kitty. She, aided by 2 young women and a young man, does her work in a downtown basement somewhere under Brooklyn Bridge. Going uptown you shake hands with the front office folks, 2 of them. In his cubicle you see John bending over the typer. That's a lad who can't afford even one hangover. He has to be right all the time. They tell me he is, too. Now here's Virginia. She's managing editor. On the Grapevine, that means a willing soul who'll do every job that the rest of the crew can't or won't. 4 out of 5 Grapevine pieces come in from out of town. If that article of yours is pretty corny, she lets you down easy. She sends you a swell letter of thanks from the whole Grapevine staff and confides that your piece has been filed away in a precious receptacle she calls the icebox. They may be able to use it later on, she hopes. Virginia has to cut and edit everybody. Drunks are so long-winded, you know. So she has to trim our gush to fit the Grapevine space. Mine, too. She can usually make contributors hit a deadline or delay the printer without getting anybody very mad. When the volunteers have proudly put the dear old Grapevine to bed, meaning they survived those anguished hours of polishing their final copy, Virginia sits back and smiles wryly. It seems the volunteers can get away with boners. But not Virginia. If anything goes wrong, if the Grapevine falls out of bed again, well, Virginia done it. Yet she loves life on the Grapevine. Every Grapeviner will tell you the same thing. For them it's truly a labor of love. There's no other explanation for what these folks do for us 12 times a year. What do you think Grapeviners would like from you and me? Appreciation. Of course. Pieces contributed? Sure, send them in, they chorus. Subscriptions. Here they brighten way up, and say, brother, now you're talking. Al, the editor, recently tipped me off. Said he, Grapevine is in a bad fix. Costs have been going sky high. Printing, postage, rent, payroll, everything. Can't help it. It means cutting the magazine in half or increasing the 25-cent price. This first is unthinkable, the second is bad news. The foundation can't take up our deficit forever. Where do we go from here? What about a lot more subscriptions? I asked. Al scratched his chin. Another 10,000 by Christmas might turn the trick, he replied. Maybe my last look into the Grapeviner's mirror was too much. I can't resist Al's blandishments anymore. Can you? Let us read and thank God. October 1958. This is Grapevine's first international issue, and I'm mighty glad to see it going to press. This event reminds me that the Grapevine's original charter was drawn by an AA lawyer, since gone to his reward. He was a fine lawyer, too. Therefore, his charter was a workmanlike and properly legalistic job. But our departed friend was much more than a good draftsman. He was an AA with a vision of what the AA of the future could be and what part the Grapevine could play to make that dream come true. When he wrote the general purpose clause of the charter, he quite forgot being the lawyer and launched into an extra enthusiastic portrayal of the Grapevine's purposes and prospects, so much so that in the pioneering year of 1944 his vision seemed all too far-fetched for most of us. One of his phrases has always stuck by me. He pictured Grapevine as AA's magic carpet which could instantly transport every reader to countless cities and hamlets and to those still lonesome outposts on distant shores where our society would one day flourish. Like no other, This international issue shows our friend's dream fulfilled. In the brief 14 years since he penned that first charter, his early vision has been far surpassed by the glorious reality of what has actually taken place among us. Let us read this issue from cover to cover and thank God. An anniversary letter, June 1959. This issue of Grapevine marks the anniversary of its founding exactly 15 years ago. The memory of some of those first editorial meetings will linger with me always. Seated around a table in a tiny cheerless room someplace downtown, the founders pored over their freshly written copy for the first issues. In those days the enthusiastic founders did everything. Not only did they do the artwork, write the bulk of the stories, they kept the books, they paid the printing bill, they typed the address on each copy, and finally licked all the stamps. So went the happy monthly paroxysm of creating what was to become the principal monthly journal of our whole society. Today, 35,000 readers see mirrored in each issue of the A Grapevine a monthly vision of the worldwide thought, feeling, and activity of our whole fellowship. It is our great means of intercommunication, a magic carpet on which each of you can ride to the more distant reaches and watch new brothers and sisters emerge from darkness into light. On this happy occasion I send my warmest affection to Grapevine readers and staff alike. May God prosper the Grapevine always. End of Part 2.